Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Settle in wherever you are. Maybe you're already in bed. Maybe you're stretched out on the couch. Maybe you're sitting in a quiet room with the lights low and the day finally letting go of you a little. Tonight we're going somewhere that most people think they already understand. We're going west, toward California, toward rivers glittering in the sun, toward muddy camps and canvas tents, and men standing knee-deep in cold water with pans in their hands, staring down at the bottom as if the whole future might be lying there in a few yellow flakes. We're going into the American gold rush, but not the version that lives in schoolbooks and souvenir shops. Not the clean version with smiling prospectors and lucky strikes and cheerful little towns that appear out of nowhere. Tonight we're going into the part of the gold rush that people whispered about afterward, if they spoke about it at all. The debts, the hunger, the bad roads, the sickness, the empty claims, the men who sold everything they owned to chase wealth and arrived to find that wealth had already moved on without them. And here is the thing that makes this story worth staying with. When people think of the gold rush, they imagine people losing their minds because they were foolish or greedy or reckless. And some were. There were plenty of dreamers who looked at a handful of dust and somehow saw a mansion, a business, a new name, a life that no longer smelled of debt or failure. But many of the people who went west were not fools. They were farmers, clerks, sailors, carpenters, teachers, widowers, younger sons, men with tired hands and worried wives, men who had watched opportunity pass them by in the towns where they were born. They were people who understood hardship already. They knew what it meant to work. They were not afraid of labour. What they did not understand, because almost no one told them honestly, was that the road to the goldfields could take everything from a person before he ever lifted a shovel. So tonight, we are not beginning with a nugget. We are not beginning with the moment someone shouted that there was gold in the river. We are beginning with the dream itself, because that is where people first started losing things. Not money yet, not homes yet, not their boots, or their health, or their lives. They first lost their judgment. They lost their sense of scale. They lost the steady caution that normally keeps a family from putting the whole future into one dangerous idea. The dream came first, and it came dressed so convincingly that even careful people mistook it for common sense. Before we step into that world, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you somewhere cold, somewhere quiet, somewhere with a window open and night air coming in? Are you in America? Maybe not very far from one of the old trails that carried people west? Or are you far from those places entirely, hearing this story from a room those miners could never have imagined? If you feel like sharing, leave it in the comments. I genuinely like knowing where these old stories travel after they leave my voice. And if this kind of slow history speaks to you, if you enjoy these ordinary lives and forgotten disasters told gently enough to rest with, it would mean a great deal if you liked the video and subscribed. You do not have to do it this second. Do it when something in the story makes you pause, or think, or feel that strange little pull that history sometimes has when it stops being dates and starts becoming people. Now let's go back to January of 1848, to a place in California that was not yet crowded with fortune seekers. At Sutter's Mill, along the American River, a carpenter named James Marshall noticed something bright in the water while inspecting a sawmill being built for John Sutter. The story is often told quickly, almost too quickly, as if history itself cannot wait to get to the exciting part. A man sees gold. Word spreads. The world rushes in. But if you slow the scene down, it becomes more interesting. California at that moment was not the California most people picture today. It was not a state yet. It had only recently come under American control after the war with Mexico. Its non-indigenous population was small. Its towns were scattered. Roads were rough. Much of the land remained unfamiliar to the Americans who were about to claim it in their imagination as the place where fortunes could simply be picked out of a river. The first people to hear the news did not all believe it. That is important. Gold rumors were not new. Frontier America was full of stories about hidden mines, lost Spanish treasure, riverbeds that supposedly shone in the sun. A person could ruin himself chasing rumors long before California entered the picture. Even John Sutter, the man on whose property the discovery was made, did not welcome the news in the way you might expect. He understood almost immediately that gold could destroy the orderly agricultural settlement he was trying to build. He had workers, he had land, he had plans. Gold did not strengthen those plans. Gold made men leave their posts. Gold made contracts meaningless. Gold made labourers look at their employer and wonder why they were working for wages when somewhere nearby the earth itself might be paying better. That was one of the first great losses of the gold rush, and it happened before the famous rush had fully begun. Ordinary order broke. Men walked away from jobs. Sailors abandoned ships in San Francisco Bay. Soldiers deserted. Storekeepers closed their doors or raised their prices beyond recognition. Farms and workshops lost workers overnight. The idea of gold was so powerful that it made regular life feel almost insulting. Imagine trying to mend a fence, or tally accounts, or unload cargo, while someone in the next town claims that men are pulling thousands of dollars from a stream with a tin pan. How do you keep sweeping the floor after that? How do you go back to your bench, your ledger, your plough, and persuade yourself that patience is still wisdom? For a little while, the first arrivals did have real advantages. The earliest miners in 1848, the ones close enough to reach the goldfields, before the news crossed oceans, sometimes found gold with astonishing ease. Some gathered it from shallow gravel bars. Some used knives, spoons, pans, and whatever tools they could improvise. There were accounts of men making more in a day than they had once earned in a month, and those accounts did not need much exaggeration to become dangerous. A true story can do more damage than a lie when people hear only the part they want. The early success of a few men became the advertisement for hundreds of thousands more. It didn't matter that the richest, easier surface deposits could be worked quickly. It didn't matter that every new arrival made the next arrival's chances worse. What mattered was that the proof existed. Someone had gone to California poor and found gold. That one fact was enough to pull men out of shops, off farms, away from families and into one of the largest migrations of the 19th century. By the end of 1848 and into 1849, the news had spread across the United States and far beyond it. Newspapers printed excited reports. Letters from California were copied, shared, and reread until the paper softened at the folds. In cities along the East Coast, men gathered around maps and argued over routes. In small towns, families sat at tables and did arithmetic by lamplight. How much could be raised by selling the horse? What would the wagon bring? Could the farm be mortgaged for 1 year? Could a brother go first and send money back? Could a husband leave his wife with relatives and return rich before anyone had time to suffer too much? These were not small questions. For many families, deciding to go west meant turning everything solid into risk. Land became cash, tools became cash, livestock became cash. A life built piece by piece over years could be converted sometimes in a single week into a grub stake, a word that sounds almost cheerful until you understand what it meant. It was the money, food, tools, clothing and credit a person needed just to reach the place where he could begin trying to make money. Before a man could lose everything in the mines, he often had to spend everything getting there. There is something almost painful about the arithmetic of hope. A man could look at his present life and see only limits. His wages were low, his debts were real, his children were growing, his prospects were narrow. Then he could look at California and see no limits at all, because he had not yet seen it with his own eyes. That gap between what is known and what is imagined is where the gold rush lived. It was not just greed. It was the belief that somewhere else, life might finally become fair. A farm that barely produced enough in Missouri. A shop that never quite cleared its debts in Ohio. a clerk's desk in New York where a young man copied numbers all day and knew that the business would never be his. California entered all of these rooms as a kind of interruption. It said, quietly at first and then louder, that the old rules might not apply if a man was brave enough to leave. And leaving became contagious. This is one of the things people often miss about the gold rush. It was not simply an individual decision repeated many times, it became a social fever. Once one man in a town decided to go, others had to consider what it meant if they stayed. Were they cautious, or were they cowardly? Were they responsible, or were they missing the one great chance of their lives? The pressure did not always come from strangers. Sometimes it came from friends forming companies together, pooling money, purchasing supplies, electing officers, writing rules in neat handwriting as if the journey itself could be made orderly by a meeting. These mining companies often had grand names, full of confidence and local pride. Men posed for farewell gatherings, churches prayed for them, newspapers listed their departures. The whole community could become involved in the leaving, which made turning back feel almost impossible. Picture one of those men on the night before departure. Not a legend, not a symbol, just a man in his own house. His trunk or pack is ready. His boots are near the door. Maybe his wife has sewn extra patches into his clothes. Maybe his mother has folded a Bible into his things. Maybe a child is asleep nearby, too young to understand why the room feels different. He has heard all the warnings by now. The journey is long. The mountains are dangerous. Dizzy's travels with crowded men. Prices in California are said to be outrageous, but warnings are weak when hope has already chosen its evidence. He has also heard of men making hundreds of dollars in a week. He has heard that gold lies in the streams. He has heard that a man willing to work can return home independent. That word mattered. Independent. It meant no landlord pressing him. No merchant extending credit with a tight mouth. No employer deciding what his time was worth. Independence was not an abstract idea to these people. It was bread, land, tools, a paid debt, a wife no longer worrying over winter, children with shoes that fit. The newspapers helped turn this hope into something that felt practical. Reports from California sometimes included specific sums, and specific sums are powerful. A vague promise can be dismissed. A number settles into the mind. Men read that miners were making $10 a day, $20 a day, sometimes far more. In a world where a labourer might earn $1 a day or less, depending on place and season, such figures were not merely attractive, they were disorienting. They made ordinary wages look like a trap. They made years of careful saving seem foolish. Why spend 10 years paying off a debt if California could erase it in one season? Why remain poor honestly when the earth itself was offering a faster arrangement? Of course, the numbers travelled better than the conditions attached to them. A letter might say that a man had found a rich claim. It might not say how many had found nothing nearby. It might mention a successful week, but not the 3 months of sickness before it. It might describe gold dust weighed out in a store, but not the price of flour, boots, shovels, bacon, blankets, medicine, or passage home. The dream became edited in transit. By the time it reached a village in Vermont or a farm in Kentucky, the mud had dried off it. The hunger had been removed. The dead animals along the trail had not made the journey into the retelling. What remained was gold, and gold is very good at making silence around everything else. There were guidebooks too, and some of them were useful in the way that dangerous things can be useful. They described routes, supplies, distances, river crossings, and what a man should carry. They also fed the idea that the journey could be mastered by preparation. Bring this much flour, bring this many pounds of bacon, take a rifle, take blankets, take medicine, leave by this date. Avoid this pass. Do not overload the wagon. These were sensible instructions, but they could create a false sense of control. A list can make the unknown seem smaller. A man reading by candlelight could imagine himself already competent in a country he had never seen. He could believe that if he bought the proper things, listened to the proper advice, and kept moving, then California would reward him for being methodical. History is full of people discovering that preparation matters and still does not guarantee mercy. The families left behind paid the first price, and they paid it quietly. For every man who went west, there were often people who stayed and absorbed the emptiness he left. Wives managed farms, shops, children, debts, and uncertainty. Parents waited for letters that might take months to arrive. Children learned to remember a father through objects, through stories, through promises that he would come home with enough money to change everything. Some women went west too, and their stories deserve their own careful attention, but the popular image of the 49er was overwhelmingly male for a reason. The rush tore through households by removing men from them in huge numbers. It created long-distance marriages before long-distance communication could soften the strain. A letter from California might be written in June and read in October. By the time reassurance arrived, the facts might already be old. By the time a wife learned that her husband was sick, he might be recovered, worse, or buried. I want you to sit with the emotional risk for a moment, because the financial risk is easier to count. Money lost can be written down. A farm sold, a mortgage taken, a debt incurred, a ticket purchased, a wagon outfitted. But how do you count the cost of a family living for 2 years around an absence? How do you measure the way hope can become a burden when everyone in the house is required to keep believing in the same distant outcome? There were families who encouraged men to go because the possible reward seemed worth it. There were families who begged them not to. There were wives who feared poverty if he stayed and widowhood if he left. The gold rush placed people inside choices where every path had danger, and then later, when men failed, it was easy for others to say they should have known better. That is one of the small cruelties of history. The outcome always looks obvious to people who did not have to make the decision before it happened. As 1849 approached, the dream became a movement. Men who had never been farther than the next county found themselves speaking of Panama, Cape Horn, the Sierra Nevada, and San Francisco, as if these places were already part of their personal story. Some planned to sail around South America, a voyage that could take months and test the patience and health of everyone aboard. Some planned to cross the Isthmus of Panama, trusting that a shorter route on the map would mean a safer one in life, which was not always true. Many planned to go overland by wagon, moving across plains, deserts, rivers and mountains in a season-long race against weather. Each route had its own dangers and its own costs. None of them were easy. But before the hardships came the imagining, and the imagining was often strangely detailed. Men pictured the return more clearly than the road. They pictured walking back into town with money. They pictured paying debts. They pictured buying land. They pictured the faces of people who had doubted them. They pictured, because people always do, the moment when suffering would be explained by success. That is one of the reasons so many Americans lost everything. They did not only invest in gold. They invested in a story about themselves. A man was not merely going to California to try his luck. He was proving that he was not trapped. He was proving that he could act. He was proving that hardship had meaning if it was chosen rather than endured. Once that kind of meaning attaches itself to a decision, turning back becomes very hard, even when prices rise, even when supplies cost more than expected, even when the first letters from the mines become less certain, even when rumours arrive that the easy gold is gone. A person can leave a plan. It is much harder to leave the version of himself that the plan created. The gold rush also arrived at a particular moment in American life when movement westward already carried moral and national weight for many white Americans. The language of expansion was everywhere. The United States had just gained vast western territories after the Mexican-American War. Newspapers, politicians, and ordinary citizens spoke of the continent as if it were waiting to be claimed, ignoring or dismissing the indigenous nations and Mexican communities already living there. That belief did not merely shape policy, it shaped ordinary ambition. California was not presented only as a place where gold had been found. It was presented as the next stage of American destiny. And destiny is a dangerous word because it makes human choices sound inevitable. A man who went west could imagine himself participating in something larger than himself. He was not abandoning a farm or risking his family's savings. He was joining history. That feeling made the risk easier to justify. But beneath the grand language, the practical reality was already sharpening. Gold fields do not remain open and easy when thousands of people rush toward the same riverbeds. The first miners could work simple deposits with pans and rockers. Later arrivals needed more equipment, more labour, more water control, more cooperation, and eventually more capital. The individual man with a pan, the figure remembered in cartoons and old illustrations, was real, but his moment of best opportunity was brief. By the time many Americans had sold property, crossed the country and reached California, they were not entering an untouched world of opportunity. They were entering a crowded, expensive, unstable economy where the men selling supplies often had better odds than the men digging for gold. The dream had been democratic. The reality was not. Still, try not to judge them too quickly. That is the temptation. From where we sit, with the whole story laid out behind us, it seems obvious that many would fail. Too many people chasing too little easy gold. Too few laws early on to protect claims fairly. Too much disease. Too much distance. Too much expense. But they did not have the whole story. They had rumour, newspaper reports, letters, pressure, hope, and a country telling them that boldness was a virtue. They had examples of real success, and real success is the strongest bait in the world. They had lives that often felt narrow, and California seemed wide. They had debts that felt permanent, and gold seemed immediate. They had work without reward, and the rivers of the Sierra promised reward without permission. So the first loss was not dramatic. It did not happen with a gunshot in a mining camp or a wagon wheel breaking in the desert. It happened in kitchens, barns, taverns, printing offices, and churchyards. It happened when a man looked at what he had and decided it was not enough. It happened when a family turned its savings into supplies. It happened when a town applauded a departure without knowing whether it was cheering a triumph or a slow disaster. It happened when hope became so loud that caution could no longer be heard clearly. Tonight, that is where we leave the old life behind. Not in California yet, not in the cold water of the American River, not in the mud of the diggings. We are still at the edge of the known world, with wagons being loaded, ships being booked, debts being signed, and families standing in doorways pretending to be braver than they feel. The gold is still far away. The men can still imagine it cleanly. Their boots are not worn through yet. Their food barrels are full. Their letters home, if they have written any, still sound confident. And ahead of them waits the part of the story that no advertisement could make beautiful for long. The journey itself, the months of movement that drained pockets, tested bodies, separated the lucky from the unlucky before anyone had even reached the mines. The first thing to understand about the journey to California is that almost no one who began it really understood its size. They understood it on paper. They could see the line on the map. They could trace the route with a finger and say the words out loud, around Cape Horn, across Panama, overland by wagon. But a map is one of the most dangerous objects in history because it makes distance look obedient. It flattens mountains, it dries rivers, it removes hunger, it turns weeks of heat and sickness and fear into a neat black line that seems to promise, if you just keep following me, eventually you will arrive. That was what thousands of Americans believed when they left for California in 1849. They were not simply travelling to a place, they were purchasing a chance, and the cost of that chance began long before they reached the mines. For many of them, the journey itself was the first great financial disaster of the gold rush. A man might leave home with enough money to outfit himself carefully, feed himself for months, pay his passage or buy his share in a wagon company, and arrive in California with almost nothing left but sore feet, damaged tools, weakened health, and the idea that now, after all of that, he had no choice but to succeed. That is a hard position to be in. Hope is one thing when you can still turn around. It becomes something much heavier when the road behind you has already consumed your savings. There were 3 main ways to reach California from the eastern United States, and every one of them could ruin a person in its own particular way. The first was the long sea route around Cape Horn, the southern tip of South America. This was the route that looked safest to some men because it avoided the plains, the desert, and the mountain passes. You boarded a ship in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, or another port, and you let the ocean carry you. That sounds almost comfortable until you remember what a months-long sea voyage in the mid-19th century actually meant. You were not stepping onto a modern passenger vessel with clean cabins, reliable meals, and a schedule. You were boarding a crowded sailing ship with too many men, too little privacy, and a route that could stretch more than 13,000 miles. If the winds were favourable and the captain was competent, the voyage might take 4 or 5 months. If the weather turned against you, if the ship was slow, if repairs were needed, if disease moved through the passengers, the trip could drag on until time itself seemed to lose shape. Men who had imagined California's immediate found themselves trapped on water for half a year, watching the same cramped deck, smelling the same bodies, eating the same hard bread, salted meat, beans, and whatever else could survive storage. Seasickness was common. Boredom was constant. Gambling spread through ships because men needed something to do with nerves that had nowhere to go. Arguments broke out over space, food, noise, politics, and money. A person could begin the voyage with confidence, and after a few weeks discover that his courage had depended on being able to walk away from things. On a ship you could not walk away. You were held in a floating room with strangers and your own decision. Cape Horn itself had a reputation that every sailor respected. The waters there could be violent, cold, and unpredictable. Storms battered ships, winds changed, sails tore. Men who had never seen the open sea before suddenly found themselves near the bottom of the world, listening to the timbers groan and wondering if the gold fields would ever matter if the ship did not survive the night. And even if the ship made it, the cost did not end with the ticket. A passenger had to bring clothing, bedding, tools, and often food or money for provisions depending on the arrangement. Some ships were honest enough. Others were overcrowded because owners understood that gold fever made men less cautious. If you could sell berths to people desperate to go west, you could make money before a single passenger saw California. That is one of the recurring truths of the gold rush. The dream of gold created markets around itself. Ship owners, outfitting merchants, brokers, provision sellers, hotel keepers, and later stage operators all learned that a man in a hurry toward a fortune was a man who could be charged more than he would normally agree to pay. The second route was shorter on paper and often more dangerous in practice. This was the Panama route. A man sailed from the eastern United States to the Caribbean side of the Isthmus of Panama, usually to the region around Chagres, crossed the narrow strip of land by river, mule, foot, or whatever arrangement could be made, and then waited on the Pacific side for a ship north to San Francisco. In theory, this route saved thousands of miles and months of sailing around South America. In reality, the word shortcut did a great deal of cruel work. The crossing itself was exhausting, wet, hot, expensive, and disorganized. Travellers moved through tropical country that many of them were completely unprepared to survive. They dealt with rain, mud, mosquitoes, fever, bad water, overcrowded stopping places, and the simple problem of too many people trying to move through a narrow route at the same time. Boats were hired at high prices. Mules became expensive. Baggage was lost, stolen, soaked, or abandoned. Men who had packed as if they were equipping themselves for a new life discovered that every extra pound became an enemy in the jungle. A trunk that seemed reasonable in New York became absurd on a muddy trail where animals collapsed and men struggled to keep their footing. Some travellers abandoned possessions they had paid dearly for because carrying them any farther was impossible. Think about that for a moment. A man sells useful things at home, buys supplies for California, pays to bring them south, and then leaves them in the mud before he has even reached the Pacific. That is not a dramatic loss in the way a shipwreck is dramatic, but it is exactly how fortunes disappear in real life, one necessary sacrifice at a time. Disease was the terror of the Panama crossing. Malaria, yellow fever, cholera, and other illnesses moved through travellers who were tired, crowded, badly fed, and often sleeping in filthy conditions. The places where people waited became traps. This was especially cruel because the route was supposed to be quick. Men chose Panama because they believed speed would protect them from the long suffering of the Cape Horn voyage or the overland trail. Instead, many reached the Pacific side and found no ship ready to take them onward. Before regular service improved, passengers could be stranded for weeks or even months, spending money every day in a place where prices rose because desperation had created its own economy. Food cost more, lodging cost more, transport cost more. A person who had calculated his budget carefully back home could watch it dissolve while doing absolutely nothing but waiting. Waiting is one of the least remembered hardships of the gold rush journey, and it deserves more attention. We like to picture movement, wagons rolling, ships sailing, men climbing passes, but many people lost money because they were forced to remain still in expensive places. A delay could be financially deadly. A month waiting for a vessel meant another month of meals, another month of lodging, another month of damaged health, another month during which the easy gold in California was being worked by people who had arrived sooner. That knowledge must have been maddening. Imagine standing on the Pacific side of Panama so much closer than you had been, close enough that the hardest part seemed as if it should be behind you, and yet still unable to move. Every day you hear rumours, a ship is coming. No, it is full. Another has been delayed. Someone says passage can be bought, but only at a price far higher than expected. Someone else says men are dying in the camps. Someone has lost his luggage. Someone has run out of money. Someone is too sick to continue. And all the while, California sits beyond the water, not as a place, but as a pressure. You have come too far to quit, but you are being drained before you arrive. The third route was the overland road, the one that lives most clearly in the American imagination. Wagons, oxen, dust, campfires, river crossings, endless grass, then desert, then mountains. This was the route chosen by tens of thousands, who gathered at jumping-off towns along the Missouri River and prepared to cross the continent by hoof, wheel and foot. Independence, St. Joseph, Council Bluffs, and other outfitting towns filled with men buying wagons, animals, flour, bacon, coffee, beans, blankets, rifles, ammunition, picks, shovels, gold pans, tents, boots, medicine, and all the little necessities that seemed minor until you lacked them. These towns became the first marketplace of disappointment. Prices rose because demand exploded. A farmer from Illinois or a clerk from Massachusetts might arrive thinking he had enough money to outfit himself properly, and discover that everyone else needed the same animals, the same wagons, the same food, at the same time. Scarcity turned ordinary goods into expensive goods. There were merchants who served travellers honestly, and there were others who understood that the road west began with people afraid of being underprepared. Fear sells very well. A man could be persuaded to buy too much because every missing item sounded like a future disaster. Extra flour, extra bacon, extra tools, extra clothing, spare parts, more ammunition, more medicine. The wagon grew heavier, the animal strained sooner, and the traveller learned the first hard rule of the overland journey. Everything you own has a weight, and every weight must be paid for again and again in animal strength, time, water, and endurance. At the start, many companies had the order. They elected captains, they wrote rules, they agreed on watches, schedules, conduct, and how disputes would be settled. This gave the journey a shape that felt reassuring. Men who had never crossed a continent could make minutes at a meeting and feel, for a little while, that they had made civilization portable. But the trail tested every rule. Wagons broke, oxen died, rivers ran high, tempers shortened. Some men wanted to push ahead, others needed rest. Some had overloaded wagons and slowed everyone down. Some became sick, some were careless with fire, animals, tools, or firearms. The group that looked so unified at departure could begin to fracture once the daily work of movement revealed differences in stamina, judgment, and luck. The overland trail was not one long adventure. It was a grinding routine. Rise early, yoke the animals, pack the bedding, check the wheels, move, stop, cook, repair, guard the animals, sleep lightly, repeat, day after day, week after week, and all the while the body was wearing down. Feet blistered, hands cracked, clothes tore, dust got into eyes, food, bedding and lungs. People who had imagined themselves riding comfortably discovered that wagons were often too full or too rough for passengers. Many walked much of the way. The journey to gold, for many, was made on foot beside the possessions they hoped would help them become rich. Cholera haunted the early gold rush trails in a way that is difficult to overstate. It struck especially hard in the crowded jumping-off towns and along the trail corridors where people gathered in large numbers, used shared water sources, and often did not understand how the disease spread. Cholera could kill with frightening speed. A person might feel ill in the morning and be dead by evening. For emigrants already anxious about time, this was terror of a very practical kind. You could pass fresh graves along the trail. You could see names carved quickly into boards or written in journals by strangers who had counted the dead as they moved west. One family's tragedy became another company's warning, and then the wagons rolled on because stopping did not bring the dead back and could endanger the living. That is one of the hardest emotional facts of the trail. People had to keep moving past suffering. A grave might be dug, a prayer said, a few possessions divided or packed away, and then the animals were yoked again. There was no long mourning period on a road governed by weather and distance. The mountains did not wait because someone was grieving. The desert did not cool because a company had buried a friend. The season was always closing ahead of them, even when the sky looked clear. Timing mattered enormously. Leave too late, and the Sierra Nevada could trap you with snow. Travel too slowly and grass for animals might be gone, water scarce, strength spent. Go too fast and you broke down men and beasts before the hardest stretches. This was the miserable arithmetic of the overland journey. Every day required judgment, and bad judgment did not always look bad when it was made. Pressing onward could be wisdom or foolishness. Resting could save the animals or cost the season. Taking a cut-off could shorten the route or lead to disaster. The trail offered choices without guarantees, and people later judged those choices with a certainty that the travellers themselves never had. Accidents took their share. Firearms discharged carelessly. Axes slipped. Wagon wheels crushed feet or legs. Animals bolted. People drowned at river crossings. Children and adults fell ill from exposure, bad food, contaminated water, or exhaustion. The overland companies included many men travelling without families, but the trail still carried women and children too, especially in the larger westward migration. Whether a person was bound for gold, land, trade, or a new settlement, the hazards did not care. The landscape treated ambition and necessity much the same. Rivers were a particular ordeal. On a map, a river is a line. On the trail, it could be a full day of fear. Wagons had to be caulked, ferried, floated, or pulled through. Animals resisted. Loads got wet. Food spoiled. A mistake could cost tools, clothing, documents, money, or lives. Some crossings had ferries operated by people who charged what the market allowed. Again, the gold rush created opportunity for those who stood along the route rather than at the end of it. A ferry owner, a blacksmith, a trader, a guide, a man with fresh animals to sell, all might profit from the movement of gold seekers. The miner was gambling on a future find. The supplier was paid in the present. That difference explains much of why so many Americans lost everything. They were buying certainty with uncertain money. Every meal, every repair, every ferry fee, every replacement animal, every medical expense reduced the amount they would have left when the actual mining began. By the time some travellers saw the western slope of the Sierra, their original plan no longer matched their condition. They had left home as men going to seek gold. They arrived as debtors to the journey itself. There were men who had to sell supplies before reaching the diggings, men who arrived without proper tools, men who reached California with animals so weakened they were nearly worthless, men who had spent so much on transport and food that their first task was not mining but finding wages. San Francisco shocked many arrivals because it was both thrilling and brutally expensive. The city had grown with astonishing speed, and speed makes a place hungry. It needed lumber, food, labour, rooms, transport, clothing, and every kind of service. Prices rose to levels that seemed unreal to newcomers. A man who had guarded a few dollars across plains or oceans could lose them quickly in a city where meals, beds, boots, and basic goods cost far more than they had at home. Some did not even go immediately to the mines because they needed to work in town to rebuild what the journey had taken. Others rushed onward because they feared that every day away from the rivers was another day someone else was taking their fortune. That fear made them vulnerable to more bad decisions. Buy quickly, move quickly, trust quickly, pay what is asked. There will be time to think later, but later, in the gold rush, often arrived with an empty pocket. The emotional cost of arrival is easy to miss. We tend to think reaching California must have felt like victory. For some, it did. They had survived Cape Horn, Panama, or the Trail. They had crossed more distance than anyone in their families had ever imagined. They had endured sickness, crowding, hunger, storms, delays, and uncertainty. But arrival also stripped away the comforting future they had carried in their minds. California was no longer an idea waiting beyond the hardship. It was a real place, crowded with other men who had carried the same idea. The rivers were not empty. The camps were not orderly. The prices were not fair. The easy places had been noticed. The best claims were contested, occupied, or already worked. A man who had survived the journey might feel a private panic he could not admit. If this did not work, what had all of it been for? That question followed many 49ers into the camps. It made them stubborn. It made them take risks. It made them stay in bad places longer than they should have. It made them write home carefully, softening the truth because to confess failure too early would be to make the sacrifice meaningless. Letters from the mines often try to balance honesty and hope. A man might admit that prices were high, that work was hard, that sickness was common, but still insist that prospects were good. He needed his family to keep believing because he needed to keep believing. This is another way people lost everything. Not all at once, but through the need to justify what had already been spent. Economists today might call it a sunk cost. The people living it would have called it not giving up. There is dignity in that, but also danger. The journey had taught them endurance, and endurance is not always the same as wisdom. Sometimes quitting is the only way to save what remains, but after months of suffering toward California, quitting felt like betraying the very suffering that had brought them there. So they moved from ship or trail into camp, from the cost of travel into the cost of survival, from the dream of reaching the gold fields into the harsher discovery that reaching them did not mean belonging to them. The road had already taken money, strength, certainty, sometimes friends, sometimes family members, sometimes health that would never fully return. And now, at last, with the journey behind them, the mountains and rivers in front of them, they stepped into the camps where hope had to become labour, where hunger had prices, where mud got into bedding and bread, and where a man could stand in the place he had risked everything to reach, and realise that the gold rush was not waiting to reward him. It was waiting to test what he had left. By the time a man reached the diggings, he had already spent so much of himself that the first sight of a mining camp could feel almost insulting. After all those months of imagining California, after the maps, the farewell dinners, the ship decks, the river crossings, the bad water, the broken wagons, the graves along the trail, there should have been some kind of arrival worthy of the sacrifice. A gate, perhaps, a town with solid streets, a place that looked like opportunity had built walls around itself and was waiting for him to enter. Instead, what many men found was mud, smoke, noise, torn canvas, wet blankets, men coughing into the morning air, cooking fires struggling under dented pots, and a crowd of strangers who looked just as tired and uncertain as they felt. The gold fields did not welcome people. They absorbed them. A man came in carrying the last pieces of a dream, and within a few days the camp began teaching him what that dream would cost in flour, bacon, boots, patience, and sleep. The word camp sounds temporary, and that is one of the reasons it fits the gold rush so well. Almost everything about those places felt temporary, even when people stayed in them for months or years. A camp might begin with a few tents near a creek where someone had found promising colour in the pan. Then more men arrived and more fires appeared in the evening, and someone stretched canvas between poles, and someone else built a rough shanty from green lumber or branches, and almost before anyone admitted it, there was a settlement. Not a town in the old sense, not a place that had grown slowly around a church, a courthouse, a school or a square. A mining camp grew around appetite. Men were there because the earth might contain money. Everything else came second. Shelter, sanitation, order, comfort, and even kindness had to make their way into the place after the hunger for gold had already set the rules. Picture it early in the morning, before the sun has fully reached the bottom of the ravine. The air is cold in a way that surprises people who imagine California as warm all the time. The men sleep in tents, brush huts, log cabins, lean-tos, wagons, or under canvas so thin that rain becomes part of the night rather than weather outside it. Blankets are damp, boots are stiff. A man wakes with his clothes already on because taking them off in a camp like that is often more trouble than comfort. His body hurts before the day begins, shoulders from lifting, knees from standing in water, hands from gripping a shovel, back from bending over gravel hour after hour. There is no quiet waking. Men cough. Someone curses at a mule. An axe strikes wood. A frying pan scrapes against stone. Smoke from small fires sits low in the camp because the air is still, and for a while the whole place smells of wet ashes, coffee if there is any, grease if someone can afford it, and unwashed wool. Breakfast was not the cheerful frontier meal we like to imagine. For many miners, it was whatever could be made quickly from supplies that had survived the journey or been purchased at painful prices from a storekeeper. Flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, hard bread, maybe dried apples, maybe rice, maybe nothing hot at all if the firewood was wet or the man was too tired to bother. The food of the camps was repetitive because repetition was what travelled well. Fresh vegetables were rare in many places, especially in the first rush years, and meat was expensive unless someone had access to game or a fresh supply route. A man could stand in one of the richest landscapes of his imagination and eat worse than he had at home. That is one of the quiet humiliations of the gold rush. The country was full of wealth, but not the kind that fed you easily. Gold dust could not be boiled into soup. A nugget could not mend a stomach that had been running on coffee, beans, and old bacon for too many days. Here is something that is easy to miss when looking back. Hunger in the gold camps did not always mean starvation. Sometimes it meant paying so much for food that every meal felt like a defeat. Sometimes it meant eating enough to stand up, but not enough to feel strong. Sometimes it meant having food in a sack and still feeling poor because replacing that sack would cost the gold you had not yet found. The miners lived inside a constant calculation. How much flour is left? How much bacon? How much coffee? How much gold came from yesterday's washing? How much must be saved for tools, for boots, for claim fees where they existed, for medicine if sickness comes, for a letter home, for the possibility of leaving? A man could find a little gold and still feel trapped because the camp took gold back from him in daily portions. The work produced dust, and the dust disappeared into food, lodging, gambling debts, laundry, alcohol, tools, and hope renewed for one more week. The actual labour of mining made the hunger worse. Surface mining with pan, rocker, shovel and cradle looked simple in drawings, but the body knew better. Men shoveled gravel into the rocker, poured water over it, rocked it by hand, cleared stones, checked riffles, repeated the motion again and again. Others stood in streams, bending over pans until their lower backs burned and their fingers numbed in the cold water. Some diverted water, dug ditches, built wing dams, moved boulders, cut timber, carried loads, and worked claims in heat, rain, or freezing mountain mornings. The body burned through food rapidly. A man doing hard labour for 10, 12, sometimes more hours in a day needed substantial nourishment, not a few slices of hard bread and a strip of salt pork. When food was costly, and cooking was inconvenient, and fatigue dulled the desire to prepare anything properly, many men lived in a state of low, grinding depletion. They were not collapsing dramatically every day. They were just a little weaker, a little thinner, a little more irritable, a little less able to think clearly than they had been the week before. That weakness mattered because mining demanded judgment. Where to dig, when to abandon a claim, whether to buy into a partnership, whether to move upstream, whether to believe a rumour about a new strike, whether to spend the last money on provisions or save it for passage somewhere else. Hunger narrows a person's world. It makes the immediate louder than the wise. A tired, underfed man is more likely to chase a rumour because staying where he is feels unbearable. He is more likely to quarrel over a claim because the claim has become the difference between eating and failing. He is more likely to gamble because hunger and hope are close relatives when the future has already gone thin. The camps were crowded with men who had arrived carrying private expectations and public embarrassment. Almost everyone knew the stories of sudden success. Almost everyone had written or spoken some version of the promise that he would come home better off. That meant failure was not merely financial. It was social. It had witnesses, even if those witnesses were far away. When a miner sat by a fire at night eating beans from a tin plate, he might be thinking not only of his stomach but of the letter he would need to send. How much truth could he put into it? Could he admit that the work was poor? Could he say that flour cost too much, that his boots were nearly gone, that he had not found enough to justify another month? Could he write to a wife who had believed in him, or a father who had doubted him, and say that California was not what the newspapers made it seem? Many men could not. So they softened it. They said things were difficult but promising. They said they had not yet struck the right place. They said they expected improvement soon. They said in one way or another that the story was not finished. And because they wrote it, they had to keep living as if it were true. Even shelter, that most basic human need, had a way of becoming another expense and another disappointment. A new arrival might expect to sleep under his own canvas, but canvas wore out. Poles broke. Rain came harder than expected. A hillside camp could turn into a channel of moving mud. A riverbank that seemed convenient in summer became dangerous when water rose. Some men built cabins from logs or rough boards, but a cabin required time, tools, materials, and often cooperation. Time spent building was time not spent mining. Materials could cost money. Tools could be borrowed only if someone trusted you. Many lived for long stretches in shelters that were never quite dry and never quite clean. Clothes hung near the fire and took on the smell of smoke without losing the damp. Bedding gathered grit. Vermin found their way into blankets and food. A man who had left a real bed at home might discover that after a few months in the diggings, sleep itself had become another thing he had gambled away. The camps were also filthy, not because the men were uniquely careless, though many were careless enough, but because sudden settlements without planning become filthy very quickly. 100 men beside a stream need water for drinking, washing, cooking, mining and waste. The same creek that supplied the rocker might receive refuse from the camp. Latrines, where they existed, were often poorly placed or poorly maintained. Garbage accumulated because no stable town authority had yet formed to remove it. Dead animals could lie too close to living quarters. Flies came. Bad smells settled in warm weather. Sickness followed. Dysentery, diarrhea, fever, scurvy from poor diet, respiratory illness from damp nights and hard exposure, and outbreaks of cholera and broader migration routes and settlements all belonged to the larger world these miners inhabited. A man might cross the continent to reach gold and be brought low by water he should not have drunk or food that had turned in the heat. Illness in a camp carried a special kind of fear because it attacked the one asset many miners still possessed, their labour. A sick man could not dig. A man who could not dig could not earn. A man who could not earn still had to eat. If he had partners, they might help for a while. If he had friends from home, they might nurse him. But many men were surrounded mostly by strangers, and strangers in the gold rush lived under pressure of their own. Compassion existed, certainly. Men did care for one another. They shared food, sat up with the sick, buried the dead, and wrote letters for those who could not write their own. But the camp was not a family, and it was not a hospital, and it was not designed for weakness. Sickness could turn a miner from a hopeful man into a burden in the space of a day. That knowledge made every fever more frightening. Imagine lying in a tent with canvas sagging above you, listening to rain hit the cloth, unable to keep food down, hearing other men leave for their claims in the morning. Their boots pass close by, their voices fade, the camp becomes quieter, but not peaceful. You know that the day's work is happening without you. You know that whatever gold might have been found by your hands is being left in the ground or taken by someone else. You try to sleep, but the ground is cold and the blanket smells of smoke and sickness, and somewhere nearby a man is hammering at a repair, and every sound reminds you that the world has not paused. At home, illness might have meant a bed, a woman's care, broth, a familiar room, neighbours, a doctor if one could be afforded. In the camp, illness often meant improvisation, a spoonful of medicine from someone's trunk, advice from men who knew little but spoke confidently, a doctor if the camp had one and if he could be paid, otherwise endurance. Food and illness were tied more closely than many miners understood. A diet heavy in flour, pork, beans and coffee could sustain a man for a while, especially if he was used to plain food, but months without fresh produce wore on the body. Scurvy was not only a sailor's disease in the old world of long voyages, it could appear anywhere people lived too long without fresh fruits or vegetables. Gums swelled, old wounds reopened, weakness deepened. Men might not always name the condition correctly, but they knew what it felt like to lose strength in a place where strength was supposed to be their way out. The great irony was that California could grow food, and eventually agriculture and supply networks expanded to meet demand. But in the first wild years of the rush, getting fresh food into remote camps was difficult and expensive. A cabbage could become a luxury. An egg could feel like a small treasure. A simple meal that would have seemed ordinary back east became valuable because distance had touched it. That distance also changed the meaning of money. At home, a dollar had a familiar weight. People knew what it bought. In California, especially in the early rush years, prices could feel almost deranged. Food that had cost little in the East might sell for many times more in San Francisco or the mining towns. Supplies became expensive not only because merchants were greedy, though some certainly were, but because transportation was difficult, demand was extreme, and everyone in the chain wanted profit. A barrel of flour had to travel by ship, wagon, mule, or river route. A tool had to survive import and transport. A boot had to reach a man who might wear it out quickly in mud and gravel. By the time goods reached a camp, they carried the cost of distance in every stitch and pound. The miner paid for that distance. He paid with gold if he had it, with credit if he could get it, with labour if someone would hire him, or with the slow collapse of his plans if he had none of these. There were men who arrived at the camps and almost immediately realised they had misjudged the whole enterprise. Not because gold did not exist. That would have been easier in a way. If there had been no gold, the dream could die cleanly. The crueler truth was that gold existed, but not necessarily for them. Some claims paid well. Some men did strike rich deposits. Some worked hard and made respectable sums. But all around those successes were men digging in poor ground, arriving too late, buying bad information, losing claims to floods or stronger men, or spending more than they produced. This is what made the camps emotionally dangerous. Proof of success was always nearby. A man could see another miner weigh dust at a store. He could hear that someone upstream had taken out ounces in a day. He could watch a lucky group celebrate. And instead of discouraging him, these examples often made him stay longer. The gold was real. Therefore, failure felt personal. The campfires at night must have been full of that tension. Men gathered to eat, smoke, repair gear, wash clothes poorly, tell stories, sing, argue, or sit silently with their thoughts. Languages mixed in the air. Americans from New England, the South, and the Midwest worked near miners from Mexico, Chile, Peru, China, France, Germany, Australia, and elsewhere. Some had mining experience and knew far more than the average American newcomer. Some brought techniques learned in older mining regions. Some were resented for their skill. The camps were international, unstable, and often deeply unfair. Prejudice, competition, and lawlessness shaped daily life, especially as American miners and local authorities increasingly targeted foreign miners through taxes, intimidation, and violence. But even before the full weight of those conflicts enters the story, it is important to understand that the camp was never simply a collection of identical men chasing identical dreams. It was a crowded human experiment under pressure, and pressure has a way of revealing every hierarchy people carry with them. For many American miners, the hunger was also moral in a strange way. They wanted more than food. They wanted confirmation that leaving had been right. Every small success fed that hunger. A few flakes in the pan could change the mood of an entire day. A better colour in the gravel could make beans taste less bleak at night. Men learned to live on signs, a promising layer of sand, a rumour from a neighbouring bar, a story of someone making a strike after weeks of failure. Hope became rationed like coffee, taken in small servings, bitter and necessary. When a pan showed nothing again and again, the camp did not merely disappoint the miner. It made him feel foolish. That feeling drove men to move. Camps rose and emptied with rumours. A creek could be crowded 1 month and nearly abandoned the next. Men packed quickly when word spread of better diggings. They left behind holes, ashes, broken tools, crude shelters, graves, and the remains of meals cooked in haste. The landscape filled with evidence of hope that had moved on. The physical environment changed around them because mining itself was destructive. Stream beds were dug up, hillsides were cut, trees were felled for cabins, fuel, sluices and supports. Clear water became muddied by washing and digging. The very rivers that had drawn men west were altered by their efforts to extract value from them. To the miner focused on survival, this damage might seem secondary. He was trying to eat, to earn, to justify the road. But the camps were not isolated from the land or from the people already living there. Indigenous communities suffered terribly as miners entered their territories, disrupted food sources, polluted waters, brought disease, and participated in violence that would become one of the darkest parts of California's history. A mining camp was not just a rough settlement of desperate men. It was also a point of invasion. The hunger for gold became hunger for land, timber, water, and control. That broader story sits under every campfire, even when the men around it spoke only of claims and prices. The daily hunger in camp had a sound. It was the scrape of a spoon along the bottom of a tin cup, the thud of a flour sack being lifted and judged by its remaining weight, the hiss of bacon in a pan when there was bacon to fry, the muttered complaint over a storekeeper's price, the silence of a man realizing he would need to borrow again. It had a look too. Belts tightened, faces browned and thinned by sun, beards grown wild because shaving was a luxury of time and water, hands swollen or cracked, eyes fixed on the pan with a concentration that was part labour and part prayer. A miner could become almost childish in his relationship to the ground, pleading with it through effort. Just one good day, just one pocket, just one claim worth the journey. And the ground, being ground, answered without sympathy. There is a detail about hunger that I think matters here. It makes people less romantic. A man who is well fed can speak nobly about destiny. A hungry man thinks about bread. The gold rush began in newspapers as a story of wealth and adventure, but in the camps it often narrowed to the question of how to get through the week. This narrowing changed men. Some became harder, some became more generous because they understood need directly. Some drank too much when they could afford it. Some gambled because the whole enterprise already felt like a gamble. So why not let cards do in an hour what a claim might not do in a month? Some found work for wages, building, hauling, cooking, washing, cutting timber, or doing whatever paid more reliably than digging. There is no shame in that. In fact, many of the men who survived best were those who adjusted quickly to the reality in front of them. But adjustment required giving up part of the original dream, and that could hurt more than hunger. By evening, the camp settled but did not soften. Fires burned in scattered points. Some men cooked alone. Others formed messes, sharing provisions and labour because cooperation made survival easier. A mess could be a practical family, temporary but important. One man baked rough bread in a pan, another boiled beans, another cut wood, another cleaned tools. They might sit on boxes, stones, logs, or directly on the ground. The conversation could be loud or nearly absent depending on the day's result. A good day made men talk. A bad day made every sound from someone else's success feel sharper. Nearby, a store or saloon might be lit late, taking back the dust that had been taken from the river. The miner stood between two hungers, the body's demand for food and the mind's demand for proof. Both had to be fed, and neither stayed satisfied for long. When you look at the camps this way, the phrase "lost everything" begins to change. It does not mean only that a man arrived with money and left without it. It can mean he lost the habits that had once steadied him. He lost regular meals. He lost clean sleep. He lost the ordinary dignity of knowing what tomorrow would probably require. He lost the protection of a settled community where people knew his name for reasons other than what claim he held. He lost health slowly, through wet boots, poor food, bad water, and constant strain. He lost confidence in small pieces, each time the pan came up light. And yet, because the camp always held out the possibility of reversal, he could not easily leave. Tomorrow might be different. The next bar might be richer. The next rumour might be true. Hunger made the present miserable, but hope made the misery seem temporary. That is what the camps did so effectively. They turned hope into a ration. They made men live on it when food was poor and money was thin. They made every hardship seem like a test that had to be passed before the reward appeared. And as long as one man nearby was finding gold, the test could continue. The camp did not have to be fair. It only had to be possible. Possibility was enough to keep thousands digging, buying, borrowing, moving and writing home that things were hard but improving. Possibility kept a man at a creek long after his body told him to stop. Possibility kept him from admitting that the journey had already cost too much. Possibility made him pay one more inflated price for flour, one more price for boots, one more price for a shovel, one more price for a night indoors when rain had finally beaten him. So when we imagine those mining camps, we should not picture them only as wild, noisy places full of adventure, though they were often noisy and sometimes wild. We should picture them as places where daily life became a negotiation with need. Need for food, need for warmth, need for tools, need for water, need for companionship, need for luck. Men did not simply dig for gold there. They tried to keep themselves from being consumed by the system that had grown around the digging. And the strange thing, the thing that becomes clearer the longer you sit with the story, is that the gold itself was only one part of that system. Around every miner stood people ready to sell him what survival required. The camp store, the boarding tent, the cook, the blacksmith, the laundry, the saloon, the express office, the freight operator, the man with mules, the man with lumber, the man with news. Some were honest, some were not. Most understood something the miner was learning too slowly. In a place where everyone is desperate for gold, the safest way to make money may be to sell something to the desperate. And that is where the next part of this story begins to press closer. Not in the creek bed, not in the pan, but across the counter where a hungry man lays down his dust and learns what dinner costs in a country built overnight. There is a very old lesson hidden inside the gold rush, and it is not the lesson most people expect. It is not that gold makes men reckless, though it certainly can. It is not that some people become rich while others go home poor, though that happened again and again. The lesson is quieter, and in some ways more uncomfortable. In a rush toward fortune, the safest money is often made by standing just outside the dream and charging admission to everyone trying to enter it. That is what the merchants learned. Some learned it by instinct, almost immediately. Some arrived already understanding it. Some began as disappointed miners and changed course after the rivers failed them. But once the camps filled and the roads thickened, and San Francisco transformed almost overnight from a small settlement into a hungry, noisy, improvised city, the pattern became clear. The miner gambled on the ground. The merchant sold him the shovel. Let us step into one of those stores for a moment. Not a polished store with clean windows and neatly arranged shelves, but a rough gold rush supply room built out of urgency. It might be in San Francisco, where ships arrived heavy with people and goods. It might be near Sacramento, close to the path into the diggings. It might be in a camp itself, where the store was little more than a tent, a counter, barrels, crates, sacks, scales, and a man who knew exactly how badly everyone needed what he had. The floor might be plank if the owner had done well, dirt if he had not yet had time, mud if the weather had been unkind. The air would smell of flour, tobacco, damp wool, leather, salt pork, coffee, lamp oil, and men who had walked too far. Against the wall there would be picks, shovels, pans, axes, rope, nails, boots, blankets, cooking pots, knives, tobacco, candles, beans, bacon, coffee, sugar, flour, medicine, paper, ink, and sometimes things that seem almost strange until you imagine how homesick the buyers were. Canned oysters, preserved fruit, a few books, a newspaper weeks old and still precious, maybe a bottle of something strong behind the counter, priced as if it had been carried there by angels. The miner entered that store with a very particular kind of vulnerability. He might be physically strong. He might have crossed plains, survived storms, buried companions, and worked 10 hours in cold water. But inside the store, strength did not matter much. Need mattered. If his boots were split, he needed boots. If his shovel broke, he needed a shovel. If his flour was gone, he needed flour. If his hands were bleeding, he needed cloth or salve. If winter was coming, he needed blankets. If he wanted to write home, he needed paper, ink, postage, and some means of getting the letter into the wider world. Every object on those shelves represented a small piece of control, and the storekeeper owned the control before the miner did. That simple fact shifted the balance of power. The man with gold in his pan might seem like the rich one, but the man behind the counter knew something more stable. He knew that every miner, lucky or unlucky, had to eat. This is where the gold rush becomes less a story about finding wealth and more a story about an economy being built around desperation. The miners arrived believing that the central question was whether the earth would give them gold. The merchants understood that the first question was whether the miners could keep themselves alive long enough to keep asking. A man could tell himself that he was independent out in the diggings, free from employers and old debts and the slow wages of the East. But each time he walked into a store, he entered a new dependence. He depended on supply chains he could not see, ships arriving from far ports, goods unloaded in San Francisco, freight carried upriver or over rough roads, mules and wagons moving into the camps. Storekeepers judging scarcity, raising prices, extending credit, refusing credit, weighing gold dust and deciding whose need could be turned into profit. Now, this does not mean every merchant was a villain. History is rarely that tidy. Many storekeepers worked hard, took real risks and faced losses of their own. Goods could be delayed, ruined, stolen, burned, or left unsold if a camp emptied suddenly. A store in the wrong place could fail just as surely as a claim in poor ground. Freight was expensive, and California in the first rush years was not a settled market, with predictable roads and warehouses and stable prices. The merchant had to guess what would be needed, where it would be needed, and how fast demand would move. But there is a difference between risk and the miner's risk. The merchant's risk was tied to things people definitely needed. The miner's risk was tied to gold that might not be there. That difference is the hinge of the entire story. The most famous example is Samuel Brannan, and we need to be careful with famous examples because they tend to become too clean in the retelling. Brannan was not just a simple shopkeeper who got lucky. He was a businessman, a newspaper publisher, a promoter, and a man with a sharp understanding of public excitement. When gold was found at Sutter's Mill, Brannan recognised not only the value of the metal, but the value of the news. According to the familiar account, he helped spread the word in San Francisco, holding up proof of gold and announcing it loudly enough that doubt began to collapse. But before shouting about gold, or at least before fully profiting from the rush he helped inflame, he had also positioned himself to sell supplies. That is the part that matters. News by itself is powerful. News combined with inventory is a business plan. Imagine the intelligence of that move. If you find gold, you may become rich, but only if the gold is plentiful, accessible, and yours to keep. If you sell equipment to people who believe they will find gold, you can profit from belief itself. The customer does not need to succeed for the sale to succeed. He only needs to be convinced enough to buy. A pan sold to a miner who finds nothing still brought money to the merchant. A shovel that breaks against hard gravel still had to be replaced. A blanket bought before a failed season still paid the store. The merchant's profit did not depend on each miner's success. It depended on the miner continuing to try. That is a hard truth, and I want you to sit with it for a moment. The gold rush was advertised as a world where ordinary men could escape wage labour and make themselves independent. But the economy that formed around it often converted independence into a different kind of trap. A man no longer worked for a boss, perhaps. He worked for supplies. He worked for flour. He worked for bacon. He worked for the next tool. He worked for the right to keep standing in the stream. At home, a worker might resent the employer who paid him too little. In California, the miner could resent no single person so easily, because the cost of living itself became the employer. Every day, the camp presented a bill. The prices could shock men who had carefully planned their expenses back home. A food that seemed ordinary in Boston, St. Louis, or Cincinnati could become expensive in the mines because it had travelled through a chain of difficulty. Flour was not simply flour by the time it reached a camp. It was flour plus ocean passage, storage, hauling, loss, spoilage, labour, animal feed, mud, risk, and the merchant's margin. A pair of boots was not simply leather and stitching, it was distance made wearable. A shovel was not only iron and wood, it was access to the possibility of earning. In a normal town, the price of a shovel might be compared to other shovels. In the gold fields, the price of a shovel was compared to the fear of having no shovel while everyone else was digging. That fear gave merchants power. It allowed them to charge prices that would have seemed absurd elsewhere. Sometimes the price was a matter of real scarcity. Sometimes it was opportunism. Often it was both tangled together so completely that no one in the moment could separate them. A miner might complain bitterly that he was being cheated, and the merchant might answer, with some truth, that the goods had been costly to bring in. The road itself had raised the price. The river had raised it. The mule driver had raised it. The ship captain had raised it. The man who unloaded the crate had raised it. California's distance from established production had raised it. And then, yes, the merchant raised it too. Inside the store, gold dust changed hands in ways that could make loss feel almost invisible. Back east, a man paid with coins, wages, paper money, or credit in familiar amounts. In the camps, miners often paid with dust weighed on scales. This gave every purchase a strange intimacy. The storekeeper placed the dust on one side, weights on the other, and the miner watched a bit of his labour become coffee or flour or a pair of socks. There is something very direct about that exchange. A week of standing in water might become a small sack of beans. A lucky day might become a coat. A month of poor returns might become debt. Dust had to be weighed fairly, and not every scale was honest. Gold had to be valued, and not every valuation favoured the miner. In a place where formal institutions were still forming, trust itself was a commodity, and the man behind the counter often controlled the terms. Credit made the relationship more dangerous. If a miner had a promising claim but little ready dust, a storekeeper might advance supplies in exchange for future payment. This could be practical and even generous, but it could also bind the miner to the store. Debt followed him into the creek. Each pan of gravel was no longer simply his chance at profit. It was also a small attempt to climb out from under what he already owed. Debt changes the feeling of labour. Work done for hope is one thing. Work done because someone has your name in a ledger is another. The gold rush made many men feel free at the start and indebted by the end. There were also stores that became centres of information, and information in the gold rush was nearly as valuable as food. Men came not only to buy, but to hear. Which creek was paying? Which camp had emptied? Where had a new strike been made? Was the route passable? Had mail arrived? Were prices lower downstream? Had a claim dispute turned violent? Was a certain partner trustworthy? The storekeeper heard everything because everyone passed through his doorway. He heard bragging, complaints, lies, warnings, drunken boasting, and private despair. He could use that knowledge. He might decide where to send goods next. He might buy claims or land. He might extend credit to one man and deny another. He might quietly prepare to move inventory before a camp declined. The miner thought he was buying supplies. Often he was also giving the merchant the raw material of business judgment. San Francisco magnified this pattern on a larger scale. Before the rush, it was a small settlement. After gold, it became a place where arrival itself turned into commerce. Ships crowded the bay, sometimes abandoned by crews who had run to the mines. Warehouses, hotels, boarding houses, saloons, restaurants, auction rooms, offices, and supply houses multiplied rapidly. A man arriving by sea might believe he had finally reached the edge of opportunity, but San Francisco met him first as a market. He needed lodging, he needed food, he needed information. He needed transport inland. He needed tools if he had not brought them, and replacement tools if what he brought had failed. He needed to protect his baggage. He needed to decide quickly because the city was expensive and the digging seemed to be calling. Merchants understood that moment perfectly. The newcomer was tired, excited, anxious, and poorly informed. He was also usually carrying whatever money remained after the journey. A city like that learns very quickly how to separate a man from the last of his careful planning. Some people made their fortunes without ever pretending to be miners. Levi Strauss arrived in San Francisco and built a dry goods business, supplying clothing and fabric to a population that wore through garments rapidly. Domingo Ghirardelli sold goods, including chocolate and other provisions, eventually building a business whose name lasted long after the first rush faded. Wells Fargo emerged in the early 1850s to provide express and banking services, moving gold, mail and money through a region where trust and transport were urgent needs. These names are often remembered as success stories, and they are, but their success also tells us something about the miners. The men digging gold created a demand so intense that whole businesses formed to handle the things mining made necessary: clothing, food, banking, shipping, mail, storage, security. The miner was the centre of the myth, but the merchant became the spine of the economy. There is a small cruelty in that. The miner's labour was visible. Everyone could see him bent over the water, lifting gravel, swinging a pick, carrying a pan. The merchant's profit could look cleaner: a counter, a scale, a ledger, a handshake. But behind that counter was a better position. The merchant did not need to strike it rich in one lucky hour. He could grow rich through repetition: one sale, another, 1,000 men each buying one necessary thing, 1,000 small margins building into a fortune while the men who paid them searched for the one large margin buried under stone. Slow accumulation won more reliably than sudden luck. This is not to say the merchants lived without discomfort. Many endured fires, floods, crime, unstable currency, wild price swings, and the general disorder of boomtown life. San Francisco burned repeatedly in the early years. Goods could vanish overnight. Partners could cheat. Customers could default. A storekeeper could be ruined by overstocking the wrong item, trusting the wrong man, or locating in a camp whose gold ran out. But the successful merchants adapted faster than many miners because their attention was on people rather than deposits. A gold deposit could be exhausted. Human need renewed itself every morning. Think about a miner after a bad week. He has found little. His food is low, his shirt is torn, his hands ache. He walks into the store telling himself he will buy only what is essential. He sees the prices and feels anger rise in him. But anger does not fill the flour sack. He argues, perhaps. The storekeeper shrugs. Maybe the next shipment will be late. Maybe the price will be higher tomorrow. Maybe another man will buy the last pair of boots. The miner pays. Outside he may curse the merchant, but tomorrow morning he will eat the merchant's flour before returning to the claim. That is dependence in its simplest form. And the merchant, if he is honest with himself, knows exactly what he has sold. Not just flour, not just boots. He has sold one more day of trying. The supplies are practical objects, but in the gold rush they carried emotional meaning. A new shovel could feel like renewed possibility. A better pan could make a man believe his luck might improve. A sack of flour could postpone the decision to leave. Coffee could make morning bearable. A letter purchased or mailed through an express office could keep a family connection alive long enough for the miner to continue pretending the sacrifice made sense. Merchants sold continuation. That was the real product. Some stores also sold escape from camp discomfort, and those profits could be just as reliable. Saloons sold liquor. Gambling tables sold the chance to change one's luck without getting wet. Restaurants sold hot meals to men tired of their own poor cooking. Boarding houses sold beds that felt almost civilized. Laundries sold cleanliness to men who had discovered how hard it was to wash clothes properly while mining. A man could lose gold without buying tools at all. He could lose it trying to feel human. After weeks in mud, A proper meal was not indulgence, it felt like repair. After sleeping on damp ground, a bed was worth more than it would have been anywhere else. The gold rush turned ordinary comforts into premium goods because deprivation had made men tender toward them. This is one of the reasons the phrase "lost everything" has to include the store counter. Many miners did not lose everything because they were robbed in an alley or because one bad claim destroyed them at once. They lost it by paying fair or unfair prices for necessary things in an unfair situation. $1 here, an ounce there, a little dust for breakfast, a little more for tobacco, more for boots, more for medicine, more for freight, more for credit interest, more for news from home. The money went out in small human amounts. It left through hunger, pain, loneliness, cold, and hope. By the time a man admitted that he had failed, the failure might not have a single dramatic moment. It had 100 receipts, if anyone had bothered to keep them. The storekeeper's ledger would tell a different story from the miner's diary. The diary might say rain all day, poor luck, hand sore, beans nearly gone, heard of better diggings up the fork. The ledger would say flour, bacon, coffee, tobacco, candles, 1 shovel, 1 pair of boots, balance unpaid. The diary preserves feeling. The ledger preserves the mechanism. Put them together and you begin to see the gold rush clearly. It was not only a search for gold, it was a machine that converted longing into purchases. Women who entered this marketplace often understood the opportunity quickly. In a male-dominated camp world, women who cooked, washed laundry, ran boarding houses, sewed, nursed or sold food could earn substantial sums because their labour supplied needs the miners had badly underestimated. Laundry especially became famous as work that could pay far better in California than in the East, precisely because so many men lacked the time, skill, equipment or patience to do it well. A woman who ran a boarding house or cooked meals could sometimes build a steadier income than the men eating at her table. This fact unsettles the standard picture of the gold rush. The man with the pan was not always the economic hero of the scene. Sometimes the person frying eggs, washing shirts, or keeping accounts had the better business. That does not make the story cheerful. It makes it more human. People saw need and responded to it. Sometimes with fairness, sometimes with exploitation, often with both. A cook who charged high prices might be taking advantage, but she was also labouring in a place where everything she used cost more too. A storekeeper might overcharge miners, but he might also be paying high freight and risking loss. A miner might complain about prices and then sell a weak claim to a newcomer with exaggerations of his own. Gold fever did not create greed from nothing. It gave ordinary self-interest a crowded stage and removed many of the restraints that settled communities usually impose. By night, the stores and saloons glowed in ways that must have felt magnetic after a day in the cold water. Lamps burning inside, voices, warmth, goods stacked where a man could see them. The sight of abundance in a camp of scarcity is powerful. A miner standing outside a store window or canvas opening could look at barrels of flour, hanging boots, blankets, tins, bottles, tools, and coffee sacks, and feel both comforted and accused. Comforted because survival was possible if he could pay. Accused because everything he needed seemed to have a price he was not yet strong enough to meet. The store held order. The camp held uncertainty. The river held maybe. For many men, that little room of goods was the real centre of the gold rush, not the claim. And while the miners bent over gravel, merchants began converting temporary chaos into lasting property. Profits from supplies became investments in lots, buildings, warehouses, wharves, transportation and banking. This is how a rush becomes a society. The first wave digs, the second wave sells, the third wave owns. By the time many miners realised the easy gold was fading, others had already turned the miners' needs into real estate and institutions. The wealth that lasted often did not come out of a pan. It came out of the structures built around the pan. A man might leave with a pouch of dust and spend it down. A merchant might leave with a city lot, a business network, a reputation, and a ledger full of men who owed him money. There is something quietly devastating about that difference. The miner sought a fortune that could be carried, dust in a pouch, nuggets in a belt, wealth as something physical, immediate, heavy in the hand. The merchant built a fortune that could remain, a store, a claim on land, a warehouse, a credit relationship, a place in the new economy. One kind of wealth glittered, the other settled into foundations, and foundations usually win. So when we ask why so many Americans lost everything during the gold rush, we have to look not only at empty pans and bad luck. We have to look at the store shelf. We have to look at the price of flour after it had crossed half the world. We have to look at a man buying a shovel because without it he could not continue, and buying coffee because without it he could not face the morning, and buying paper because someone at home needed to believe he was still all right. We have to look at the merchants who did not need to convince the earth to surrender anything. They only needed to stand between the miner and the necessities of life. By the time the miner left the store, the transaction was already fading into routine. He lifted the sack, tucked the tobacco away, adjusted the new handle of the shovel in his palm, or counted what little dust remained. Outside, the camp continued. The camp. Smoke moved low. Men shouted near the creek. Somewhere a hammer struck iron. Somewhere someone laughed too loudly outside a saloon. The miner told himself that tomorrow would pay for today. That is what made the prices bearable. Tomorrow would cover the flour. Tomorrow would cover the boots. Tomorrow would cover the debt. Tomorrow would make the merchant's profit irrelevant because the claim would finally begin to show what it had promised. But tomorrow, in the gold fields, was crowded with other men making the same bargain, and the ground beneath them was not infinite. The richest bars were being worked down. The easy gravel was disappearing. The claims that seemed so solid in rumour could shift, fail, flood, vanish, or be taken. And after the store had taken its share, the miner still had to return to the water and face the more personal disappointment waiting in the pan. There is a moment in almost every gold rush story when the word claim appears, and it sounds much sturdier than it really was. A man had a claim. He worked his claim. He defended his claim. He sold his claim. The word has a solid feeling to it, almost legal, almost respectable, like a deed folded safely in a desk drawer or a fence line everyone in town agrees not to cross. But in the California gold fields, especially in the first wild years after 1848, a claim was often something much thinner than that. It could be a few stakes in the ground, a notice scratched onto a board, a rough agreement made at a miners' meeting, a stretch of riverbank everyone nearby understood belonged to you only as long as you kept working it, defending it, and remaining useful enough to the local order that people respected your right to stay. It was ownership, yes, but not the kind of ownership most Americans had grown up imagining. It was conditional ownership. It was watched ownership. It was ownership with mud under its fingernails and a rifle leaning somewhere close by. Think about the ordinary idea of property for a moment. A farm back east had boundaries. Maybe they were disputed now and then, but the system itself was familiar. Deeds, county records, neighbours who remembered old lines, courts that could hear disagreements, fences that meant something. A man might spend years paying for land, but once he owned it, the land did not usually vanish because he went to town for a day. It did not become someone else's because rain fell, because a stranger arrived, because a rumour moved through the valley, or because a crowd decided the rules had changed. In the diggings, that steadiness was missing. California had come under American control only recently. The gold was found before stable civil government could fully take hold in the mining regions. Men arrived faster than the institutions could follow. Courts, surveyors, sheriffs, and written law lagged behind the movement of shovels. So the miners built their own systems, not because they were philosophers of democracy sitting around by the creek, thinking carefully about property rights, but because without rules, every good piece of ground would become a fight. The rules varied from district to district, And this mattered more than a newcomer might realise. One camp might allow a claim of a certain size along a creek, another might permit less. One district might require a claim to be worked every day or every few days. Another might allow short absences if a man was sick or gathering supplies. Some rules were written down, some were remembered, some were announced at meetings and enforced by the men who had been present, whether or not the next wave of arrivals had agreed to them. This was practical, but it was also dangerous because a man's understanding of his rights could change simply by crossing into a different gulch. He could come from one set of customs into another and discover that what he thought was normal counted for nothing there. The goldfields did not have one law. They had many little laws, made quickly by tired men with financial stakes in the outcome. At first glance, this kind of self-government can look impressive, and in some ways it was. Men gathered, debated, voted, elected officers, recorded claims, and held informal courts to settle disputes. In the absence of formal authority, they created working systems with remarkable speed. But a working system is not the same as a gentle one. The purpose of these rules was not to protect every dream equally. The purpose was to keep the camp functioning and to prevent immediate chaos among people who all wanted access to the same limited ground. If the majority believed you had abandoned your claim could be open to another man. If they believed you had taken too much ground, it could be reduced. If they decided a certain group of miners should not be allowed the same rights, the rules could be bent, rewritten, or enforced unevenly. The camp meeting could be democracy, but it could also be pressure wearing a democratic coat. Now picture a miner who has finally found ground worth working. Not a fortune, not yet, but enough colour in the pan to keep him from moving on. Maybe he and two partners have staked a stretch near a bend in the creek. They have worked poor ground for weeks, spent too much at the store, eaten badly, slept worse. And then one afternoon the gravel begins to show promise. Not a dramatic fist-sized nugget. Those were rare enough to become legends precisely because most men never saw one. What he finds is finer, steadier, enough gold dust and small pieces caught in the rocker to make the day feel different from the last 20 days. At supper, the men are quieter than usual, because they do not want to draw attention, but attention always travels in a camp. Someone notices the better mood, someone sees them buying supplies with more confidence, someone watches where they return in the morning. By the next day or the day after, men nearby have heard that the bend is paying. This is where a claim began to feel less like property and more like a candle flame in a draft. The miner had to keep working it, but the more he worked it successfully, the more valuable it became, and the more likely others were to look at it closely. Success made a claim visible. Visibility made it vulnerable. If he left to buy supplies, someone might argue he had abandoned it. If he became sick and could not work, someone might say the local rules required labour, and he was failing to perform it. If his partner left, the division of shares might be questioned. If a newcomer believed the boundary stakes were too wide, or conveniently moved one in the night, a dispute could begin before breakfast. There was no fence strong enough to hold back human need when everyone believed the next few feet of gravel might contain the difference between ruin and return. Claim jumping was not a colourful side detail of the gold rush. It was one of the central fears of camp life. The phrase sounds almost playful now, like something from an old Western story, but for the miner it meant the possible theft of everything he had left. If another man began working ground already claimed, the conflict could move quickly from words to threats. Sometimes the question was honest. Had the original miner abandoned the claim? Had he failed to work it according to the district rules? Were the boundaries marked clearly? Did illness excuse absence? Did a partner have the right to sell his share? Could one man hold several claims through associates? These were not always simple disputes between a thief and a victim. Often they were arguments made possible by the uncertainty of the system itself. When the law is thin, people press their fingers into every soft spot. The requirement to actively work a claim was one of the most important and most unforgiving features of the mining districts. It made sense from the point of view of the camp. If a man could stake ground and then disappear for weeks, the richest areas could be locked up by people doing nothing while latecomers had no place to try their luck. Active work prevented speculation, or at least tried to. It kept ground moving. It rewarded labour over mere possession. On paper, this sounded fair. In practice, it punished weakness. A man who became ill could lose his claim. A man who needed to travel for supplies could return to find his right questioned. A man whose partner failed him could be accused of leaving ground idle. A man who was exhausted might keep working past sense because rest itself carried risk. The claim had to be fed with labour the way the body had to be fed with food. There is something almost cruelly circular about that. A miner needed the claim to survive, but he also had to survive well enough to keep the claim. If hunger weakened him, the claim suffered. If sickness took him off the creek, the claim became vulnerable. If he spent too long seeking medicine or better food, someone else might see absence as opportunity. The same camp that demanded hard labour also created conditions that made hard labour difficult to sustain. Poor diet, bad water, wet clothes, cold mornings and long hours could bring a man down, and once he was down, the rules that had seemed reasonable when he was strong could become a trap. Natural forces could erase a claim as surely as people could. Rivers were not obedient simply because men had drawn lines beside them. A claim on a gravel bar could be promising in July and change completely by winter water. Floods could tear through workings, wash away equipment, collapse carefully dug holes, bury pay dirt under new debris, or shift the channel enough that yesterday's plan no longer made sense. A wing dam built to divert water might fail overnight. A sluice could be damaged. A rocker could be carried away. Timbering could collapse. The miner might wake to find that the place he had defended so fiercely had been rearranged by weather without the slightest interest in his rights. In settled farming country, weather could ruin crops, but the field remained. In the diggings, the very shape of the workplace could alter. Ground was not a stage on which labour happened. It was an active force in the story. Exhaustion of the ground was even more common. A claim could vanish not because anyone stole it, and not because water destroyed it, but because it stopped paying. This was perhaps the most ordinary heartbreak of all. The first few days might show promise. The men worked harder, stayed longer, bought extra provisions, maybe even wrote home with cautious optimism. Then the gold thinned. The pan came up light. The good layer ended. The gravel changed. They dug deeper, wider, upstream, downstream. They told themselves the deposit must continue just a little farther. A man who has already invested weeks into a claim does not abandon it easily. He has memories attached to the first good pan. He has calculations built around it. He has already imagined what the claim might become, so he works poor ground longer than he should because leaving means admitting that the earlier promise was temporary. This is one of the quietest ways the gold rush took everything from people. It trained them to confuse a good beginning with a good future. A claim could pay enough at first to keep a man there, but not enough in the end to save him. It could produce just enough gold to purchase supplies, repair tools, cover debts, and encourage another week of work without ever producing the surplus he had crossed a continent to find. That kind of claim did not feel like failure while it was happening. It felt like almost rich ground, almost the right spot, almost a breakthrough, almost is one of the most expensive words in history. Partnerships added another layer of uncertainty. Many miners worked in groups because the labour required more than one pair of hands. One man shovelled, another rocked the cradle, another carried water, cleared stones, cut timber, or cooked. Partnerships allowed men to claim more effectively and work more efficiently, but they also created human complications. Who owned what share? Who worked hardest? Who had contributed supplies? Who had missed days? Who had the right to sell out? What happened if one partner wanted to leave and another wanted to stay? A claim could be technically secure and still fall apart because the men holding it could not remain united. In a camp full of exhaustion and financial pressure, even old friendships could fray. Men who had left home together, crossed the plains together, survived sickness together, might find themselves arguing over ounces, boundaries, and who had carried more than his share of the burden. The sale of claims became its own dangerous marketplace. A man could sell a claim that was genuinely promising, but he could also sell hope wrapped in a few carefully chosen facts. A buyer might inspect the ground, test a pan or two, ask questions, and still misjudge what he was purchasing. Claims could be salted, with gold placed deliberately to make poor ground seem rich, though not every bad claim was a fraud. Sometimes the seller believed what he was saying because he needed to believe it. Sometimes both men were trapped in the same uncertainty, one trying to recover losses by selling, the other trying to recover losses by buying. A claim sale could transfer not wealth, but disappointment. The new owner inherited the whole, the stakes, the rumour, and the expectation that somehow his own labour would succeed where the last man's had not. There were also men who never intended to work honestly at all. The rush attracted not only dreamers, but opportunists who understood that confusion itself could be mined. They watched newcomers, they offered information for a price, they sold shares in ventures that existed mostly in talk, they guided men toward poor ground, they moved markers, they spread rumours to inflate values, they presented confidence as evidence. In ordinary life, a person has neighbours, reputation and time to help sort truth from performance. In the diggings, strangers arrived constantly, and the future moved too quickly for caution to do its proper work. A man who looked knowledgeable could become dangerous simply because others were desperate to be advised. The legal position of different miners was not equal, and this made claims disappear for some groups faster and more brutally than for others. Mexican and Chilean miners often had experience with placer mining and sometimes worked more effectively than inexperienced American arrivals. Their success made them targets. Chinese miners, who began arriving in larger numbers in the early 1850s, faced hostility, discriminatory taxes and violence. Foreign miners could be driven from claims not because they had failed to work them, but because others wanted the ground and had the power to take it. The gold rush was not a fair contest of individual effort. It was shaped by race, nationality, force, and law. The American miner who complained of losing his claim to a jumper might still live inside a system that allowed him, or men like him, to help dispossess someone else. That contradiction sits at the aster of the gold fields. Many men saw themselves as victims of unfairness while participating in unfairness when it favoured them. For indigenous people in California, the question of claims was part of a far larger catastrophe. The miners argued over rights to creek beds and bars as if the land had been waiting empty for them to organise it. It had not. Indigenous communities had lived with those rivers, forests, and valleys for generations. Mining damaged food sources, polluted water, brought disease, and intensified violence and displacement. A miner's claim might vanish overnight because another man jumped it. Indigenous homelands were being invaded under a much broader and more devastating claim made by the newcomers as a whole. It is important not to let the miners' losses, real as they were, hide the larger violence that made the entire rush possible. Still, inside the miner's own narrow field of vision, the fear was immediate and personal. He had come to California because he believed land and labour might finally meet without the barriers of old society. No landlord, no factory owner, no long apprenticeship, no inherited privilege. Just a man, a shovel, a pan, and the chance to take wealth from the earth by working harder than the next fellow. The claim was the physical expression of that belief. Those stakes in the ground said, for this brief stretch, I have a chance. When the claim failed, or was taken, or was exhausted, or was judged abandoned, the loss struck deeper than the ground itself. It attacked the belief that the gold rush had offered a fair bargain. At night, men guarded that belief in different ways. Some slept near their claims when trouble was expected. Some organised with partners for safety. Some attended miners' meetings and argued rules late into the evening. Some carried weapons openly not because they wanted violence, though some did, but because in a place where formal enforcement was uncertain, the appearance of readiness could prevent a test. There is a hard kind of loneliness in that. Imagine sleeping near the ground you hope will save you, not in a proper home, not beside family, but under canvas or brush, listening for footsteps, wondering whether the men nearby are neighbours, competitors, witnesses, or threats. The claim gives purpose to the day, but it gives anxiety to the night. A good claim changed how others saw a man. Yesterday he might have been another hungry miner with muddy trousers and poor luck. Today, if his ground showed colour, he became interesting. Men asked questions. They watched his movements. Storekeepers might extend credit more readily. Partners might become more loyal or more suspicious. Strangers might offer to buy him out. Success brought attention before it brought security. And if the claim then failed, the fall was public. People knew he had hoped. They knew he had bought more supplies. They knew he had stayed. They knew perhaps that he had written home too soon. Failure in a camp had very few walls around it. The constant movement from claim to claim created a strange kind of homelessness, even among men who remained in the same region. A miner could spend a week on one bar, 3 weeks in another gulch, 2 days at a rumoured strike, a month in partnership somewhere else, and still feel no closer to belonging anywhere. He was always evaluating, always comparing, always preparing to abandon what he had just begun. This restless movement was not merely adventurous. It was often forced by disappointment. The ground did not pay, so he moved. The claim was disputed, so he moved. The camp became crowded, so he moved. Prices rose, water failed, a partner left, sickness came, rumours pulled him elsewhere. Each move cost strength and money. Each move required packing, walking, carrying, rebuilding a camp, learning a new district's rules, and entering a new social order where his name meant nothing again. That is the part of the gold rush that the word rush captures better than people realise. It was not only a rush to California, it was a rush within California, from creek to creek, bar to bar, rumour to rumour. Men were always arriving too late somewhere and leaving too early somewhere else. They chased reports that had been fresh when spoken and stale by the time they acted on them. A rich discovery could draw hundreds or thousands, and the act of drawing them could ruin the opportunity that had attracted them. By the time the last arrivals reached the new diggings, the best claims might already be held, disputed, or exhausted. Hope moved faster than wagons, but men still had to walk. There is a particular sadness in the claim that pays just enough to keep a man from leaving. The terrible claim is easier to abandon. The rich claim is easy to understand, but the middling claim, the one that yields a little colour, then nothing, then a promising pan, then another empty day, can hold a man like a hand on his sleeve. He tells himself he is close. He tells himself the next layer will improve. He tells himself that others gave up too soon. He tells himself that persistence is the difference between failure and success, because that is what the whole culture has taught him to believe. And sometimes persistence is exactly that. Sometimes the man who stays finds what others missed, but often persistence merely deepens the hole. A claim could also vanish through the arrival of better technology and more capital. In the earliest years, individual miners and small groups could work shallow placer deposits with simple tools. As the easy gold declined, mining became more complex. Long toms, sluices, dams, ditches, and later hydraulic methods favoured men and companies with resources. The lone miner with a pan did not disappear immediately, but his best moment was passing. Ground that had once seemed open to anyone increasingly required investment, coordination, and control of water. A man could hold a claim and still lack the means to work it profitably. Ownership without capital became another kind of frustration. The gold might be there, but beyond his practical reach. There are few things more bitter than standing above wealth you cannot afford to extract. By the early 1850s, this shift was becoming harder to ignore. The dream of the independent miner did not die all at once. It lingered because some men still succeeded, and because myths are more durable than market conditions. But the balance was changing. The claims that could be worked with the simplest tools had been heavily searched. The camps had grown more organised, more expensive, more contested. The people who had arrived first had taken much of the easiest ground. Latecomers needed luck, money, partnerships, or a willingness to work for wages. Many had not come to California to become wage labourers in someone else's mining operation. They had come to escape that arrangement. Yet the gold fields, through their own development, began pushing them back toward it. So a man could lose his claim in many ways, and each way carried its own humiliation. He could lose it to another man's aggression. He could lose it to local rules that declared him absent. He could lose it to sickness because his body failed before his ambition did. He could lose it to floodwater. He could lose it to bad geology. He could lose it to a partner's impatience. He could sell it too cheaply because he needed money immediately, then hear later that the buyer had found gold deeper down. He could buy it too dearly because he believed a story that sounded just possible enough. He could keep it and still lose because the claim never produced more than survival. The gold rush did not need one method of ruin. It had dozens. Near the end of a long day, when a miner cleaned up the last of the work and looked at what had come from the claim, the result had to answer more than one question. It had to answer whether he could eat, whether he could pay what he owed, whether he could stay, whether he could write home with confidence, whether he could continue to think of himself as a man moving toward success rather than away from it. That is a great deal of weight for a few flakes in a pan. Some nights the answer was almost enough. Some nights it was nothing at all. And then came the human noise around the result. A partner asking whether they should keep working. A neighbour reporting better colour upstream. A storekeeper reminding him of his balance. A newcomer asking too many questions. A camp meeting called to settle a boundary. A rumour that foreign miners were being pushed out nearby. A warning that the river may rise. A letter from home asking when he expects to return. The claim was never only a piece of ground. It was the centre of a web of pressure, and every strand pulled. That is why the vanished claim belongs so deeply in this story of Americans losing everything. It was the place where the gold rush made its promise most concrete, and then most often took it back. The journey could be blamed on distance. The stores could be blamed on prices. Hunger could be blamed on hardship. But the claim was supposed to be the answer to all of that. Once a man had a claim, he had reached the real beginning. He had something under his feet that might justify the road behind him. When that claim disappeared, failed, or was taken, the loss felt like a second migration. Only this time there was no grand departure, no community farewell, no confident map. Just a man packing his tools again, walking toward another creek because standing still had become impossible. The camp did not stop for him. Stop. Men kept digging. Fires kept burning. Merchants kept weighing dust. New arrivals kept asking where the good ground was. Somewhere nearby, someone did find gold, and that fact made leaving harder. Somewhere farther on, another rumour began to move through the trees and tents. A strike, a rich bar, a place not yet crowded. Men lifted their heads when they heard it. Even the disappointed listened, especially the disappointed. Because after a claim vanished, the mine needed a new place to put tomorrow. So they gathered their tools, tightened their belts, argued with partners, paid what debts they could, and moved again through a landscape that was becoming less generous each month. Behind them lay worked out gravel, broken stakes, and the memory of ground that had almost been enough. Ahead of them waited more than poor claims and bad luck. The longer men stayed in the gold country, the more the strain worked inward, into the body, into the temper, into the lonely spaces that no pan of gold could fill. The advertisements did not talk about the smell of sickness. They did not describe the way a mining camp could change after one bad week of fever, when the usual sounds of shovels and argument and cooking fires were interrupted by men coughing in their tents, men asking who had quinine, men carrying water to someone who could no longer stand. They did not mention the bodies found along the road to California, or the graves scraped into hard ground beside the overland trail, or the passengers who left eastern ports with strong voices and never saw San Francisco because disease moved through a ship faster than hope could keep up. The advertisement spoke of gold, because gold was the part that could be sold. They spoke of opportunity, enterprise, independence, and the grand country opening in the West. They did not say that a man might reach the very place he had dreamed of and lose everything to bad water, one infected cut, one careless quarrel, one cold night, or the simple fact that human beings are not built to live indefinitely under pressure without comfort, order, or anyone who knows them well. By now in our story, the miner has come far enough that turning back no longer feels simple. He has left home. He has spent money. He has survived the journey, or at least survived enough of it to stand in the diggings. He has bought supplies at prices that still make him angry when he thinks about them. He has worked claims that promised more than they gave. He has learned that gold is real but not obedient. And now another truth begins to settle over him, not as a single dramatic revelation, but as a daily awareness that enters through the body first. California is not merely difficult. California is wearing him down. Start with sickness, because sickness was one of the quiet engines of ruin in the gold rush. It did not need to be spectacular to destroy a man. A miner could be careful, sober, hard-working, and still find himself helpless because the conditions around him were stronger than his intentions. Camps were crowded and often poorly drained. Men lived close together in tents, cabins, brush shelters, and improvised rooms that were cold at night and dirty by day. Water sources were used for drinking, washing, cooking, mining, and waste, sometimes by the same people in the same general area. Food was limited and repetitive. Sleep was poor. Clothing stayed wet. Hands were cut. Feet were blistered. And minor injuries became serious when there was no proper care and no time to rest. The body can endure hardship for a while. It is very good at that. But hardship stacked on hardship eventually becomes a kind of arithmetic, and the body keeps the total whether the mind admits it or not. Cholera was one of the great terrors of the migration and the camps. Men feared it because it could move so quickly. A person might be standing in the morning, complaining of stomach trouble by noon, and near death before the day was out. On the overland routes, cholera left a trail of graves in certain seasons, striking people who had crowded into departure towns, shared contaminated water, and moved west without understanding the invisible path of the disease. In the mining regions, disease found similar opportunities. Water was life in the gold country, but water was also the tool of mining, the drain of camp waste, and sometimes the carrier of death. A creek could look clean in the morning light and still be dangerous. Men who had crossed deserts and mountains could be brought down by the cup they lifted to their mouths. There is something especially cruel about a disease like that in a place built around labour. In an ordinary home, illness is frightening enough. In a mining camp, illness is also financial. The sick man does not simply suffer, he stops producing. His claim goes idle, his partners grow anxious, his food runs low, his debt remains. If he is alone, he must depend on the kindness of men who may have very little to spare. If he is too weak to cook, someone else must cook for him. If he is too weak to fetch water, someone else must bring it. Every act of care has a cost in a camp where the day is already full, and every healthy man is trying to keep himself from failing. This does not mean miners were without compassion. They nursed one another. They sat beside the dying. They buried strangers. They wrote letters home when a man could no longer hold the pen. But compassion in a mining camp had to work against the pressure of survival. and survival was always standing nearby with its hand out. Scurvy and poor diet did their slower work too. A diet of flour, beans, pork, coffee, and whatever else could be stored or purchased at punishing prices might keep a man alive, but it did not always keep him well. Fresh vegetables and fruit were not equally available to all camps, and when they were available they could be expensive. A man might know that he needed better food and still choose flour because flour kept longer, stretched farther, and cost less than the fresh things his body missed. Weakness accumulated, gums became sore, old wounds healed badly, legs ached, the spirit lowered. That last part matters. Poor food does not only change the body, it changes the way the world feels. A man with enough strength can look at a hard day and call it a challenge. A man who has been underfed for weeks can look at the same day and feel something closer to despair. Then there were the injuries. A mining camp was full of sharp tools, heavy stones, rough timber, firearms, animals, unstable banks, cold rivers, makeshift machinery, and men too tired to handle all of it carefully. A pick could glance, a shovel could slip, a bank could collapse, a foot could be crushed by a wagon wheel or a falling rock, a hand could be cut and then swollen by infection. A man could fall into water, take chill, and never fully recover. These were not rare exceptions. They were part of ordinary risk. Modern people often think of danger as an event. In the diggings, danger was more like weather. It surrounded the work so constantly that people adjusted to it until the day it selected them. A doctor, if one was nearby, might be expensive, inexperienced, overwhelmed, or working with the limited medical knowledge of the time. Medicine in the mid-19th century could help in some cases and harm in others. Men treated themselves with patent remedies, alcohol, herbs, purgatives, quinine when they had it, and advice from whoever sounded most certain. Some camp doctors were capable and dedicated, others were merely men with bottles and confidence. A sick miner had to make judgments while feverish, frightened, and poor. That is a bad condition in which to decide whom to trust. Violence was the other unadvertised fact, and it had many forms. Some of it came from the instability of camps where formal law arrived late or weakly. Men carried weapons, they worked beside strangers, they guarded claims that might represent the last chance of recovering what they had spent. They drank in saloons after days of frustration. They gambled with money they could not afford to lose. They argued over boundaries, debts, tools, partners, accusations of theft, insults, and rumours. In a settled town, there are usually people and institutions that slow a quarrel down. Neighbours intervene, a constable is called. Families pull men home, reputation matters over years. In a mining camp, many of those restraints were thinner. A man could be known only by a nickname, a claim, a country of origin, or the amount of dust he seemed to be carrying. The future was short. The temper was close to the surface. Claim disputes could become violent because the claim was never just dirt. It was food, debt, pride, return passage, proof, and sometimes the only thing standing between a man and complete failure. If another miner crossed a boundary, moved a stake, accused him of abandonment, or worked ground he believed was his, the conflict carried more force than the visible issue. It was not only about a few feet of gravel, it was about the whole decision to come west. It was about the months of travel, the money spent, the family waiting, the shame of returning poor. When a man defended a claim, he might be defending a future that had already become fragile. That kind of defence can become dangerous quickly. Informal justice filled the spaces where official law was absent or distrusted. Miners' meetings, camp courts, committees, and vigilante actions all appeared in different forms. Some were attempts to impose order where there would otherwise have been chaos. Men did need ways to settle theft, violence, and claim disputes. But informal justice can become rough justice, and rough justice can become injustice before anyone has time to name the difference. Accused men might be tried by crowds. Punishments could be swift, A thief might be whipped, banished, or hanged depending on the camp, the accusation, the mood, and who had influence. In later memory, this sometimes becomes part of the romance of the frontier, as if quick justice were clean justice. It was not always clean. It was justice without many safeguards, shaped by fear, anger, prejudice, and urgency. The violence that was most destructive, however, was not only the violence between miners over claims. It was the organised and repeated violence directed at people who were treated as obstacles to Anglo-American control of the gold country. Mexican and Chilean miners, many of whom had reached the diggings early and often possessed real mining experience, faced growing hostility as American miners became more numerous and more territorial. Their skill and early success could make them targets. Foreign miners' taxes, intimidation, expulsions, and attacks were part of the process by which the gold fields became more unequal. A man from Sonora or Chile could work hard, follow local rules, and still find that his right to remain depended on the tolerance of people who wanted him gone. The language of fairness was often used by men who were willing to be unfair when competition frightened them. Chinese miners faced their own forms of exclusion, discrimination, taxation, and violence as their numbers grew in the early 1850s and beyond. Many came with the same general motive as others, to earn money, support families, and survive economic hardship at home. They often worked claims abandoned by others, reworked gravel thought to be exhausted, organised labour carefully, and endured conditions others had left behind. Their persistence should have commanded respect. Instead, it often provoked resentment. In the gold rush, success by the wrong person could be treated as provocation. That is one of the uglier truths of the period. The dream had been advertised as open, but many miners believed it was open chiefly for themselves. For native Californians, the gold rush was catastrophic on a scale that must be spoken plainly. The mining camps entered lands already inhabited by indigenous communities, with their own economies, food sources, roots, sacred places, and histories. The rush brought disease, displacement, forced labour, starvation, environmental destruction, and direct violence. Rivers were torn up. Hunting and gathering grounds were disrupted. Settlements expanded. State and local policies, militias, and individual acts of brutality combined into a campaign of dispossession and killing. The miners' hunger for gold did not remain in the creek bed. It moved outward into forests, villages, meadows, and families. When we talk about Americans losing everything in the gold rush, we must remember that some Americans lost savings, health, or pride, while native people lost land, kin, safety, and whole ways of life under violence that was not accidental to the rush, but deeply connected to it. This is difficult material for a quiet history program, but leaving it out would make the story false. The gold rush was not only a sad tale of disappointed prospectors, it was also a violent invasion with winners, victims, bystanders, and people who were all of these at different moments depending on where they stood. A white miner might write home about his own hardship honestly and still not see clearly the larger hardship his presence helped create. He might complain of theft while occupying stolen ground. He might fear violence while belonging to the group most able to use it. History asks us to hold these things together without smoothing them down. The miner's loneliness can be real. The suffering of indigenous people can be larger and more devastating. One truth does not cancel the other. It only prevents the story from becoming too easy. And then there was loneliness, the condition that did not always appear in official records because loneliness rarely leaves a receipt. The gold rush was overwhelmingly male in its early years, and that imbalance changed everything about daily life. Many men had left wives, children, parents, sisters, churches, neighbours, and familiar streets behind. They entered camps full of other men who were often just as displaced, but being surrounded by people is not the same as being known. A mining camp could be crowded and lonely at the same time. In fact, its crowding may have made the loneliness worse, A man might hear voices all day and still have no one nearby who remembered him before California. Think of the ordinary comforts he had lost. Not luxuries, ordinary things, a stable bed, a regular table. A woman's voice in the household, which for many men of that period meant not only affection, but the domestic order they had relied on without fully noticing. Children making noise in the next room, a church bell on Sunday, neighbours who knew his family, the rhythm of seasons on familiar land. Even obligations can become comforts when they are known. In the camps, many obligations were reduced to the same few questions. Did the claim pay? Was there food? Were the tools sound? Could debt be held off another week? This narrowing was practical, but it made life smaller. A man had come west imagining expansion, and many found their days reduced to gravel, water, prices and fatigue. Letters were lifelines, but they could also be instruments of pain. Mail was delayed, expensive, uncertain, and emotionally heavy. A letter from home might arrive months after it was written, carrying news that had already changed by the time it reached the miner's hand. A child had been sick, a debt was due, a harvest had failed, a wife was lonely, a parent had died, a baby had been born and was already no longer a newborn by the time the father learned it. These letters could comfort a man and wound him in the same sitting. They reminded him that he belonged somewhere else, and that the somewhere else was continuing without him. He had left to improve the family's future, but the family's present was happening in his absence. Writing home required its own courage. What could he say? If he told the truth completely, he might alarm the people waiting for him. If he lied too much, he would trap himself in the lie. So many letters from difficult places carry that careful middle tone. Things are hard, but improving. I have not yet done as well as expected, but prospects remain good. I am in health, or nearly so. Do not worry. Give my love to the children. Tell father I still believe I shall succeed. These sentences are not merely information. They are emotional labour. The man is trying to protect others from fear while protecting himself from shame. A letter home can become a small performance of confidence, written by someone who badly needs confidence to be real. Loneliness also made men vulnerable to the economies of comfort that grew around the camps. Saloons were not only places to drink, they were places to be near other human beings after dark. Gambling tables were not only about money. They were about suspense, company, noise, and the chance that luck might arrive without another day in the creek. Theatres, music halls, dance houses and brothels appeared where population and money could support them. Some of these places provided genuine relief from the bleakness of camp routine. Some ruined men faster, often they did both. A miner who had not heard gentle conversation in weeks, who had eaten badly, worked poorly, and lost hope in his claim, could spend dust in an evening not because he was foolish in some simple way, but because he was tired of feeling like a machine for moving gravel. Alcohol deserves to be handled honestly. Not every miner drank heavily. Not every saloon was a den of ruin. But drinking was common, and for some men it became the fastest way to turn disappointment into debt, quarrel, injury, or worse. A drink could warm the body, quiet pain, loosen speech, create companionship, and make failure feel less immediate. That is precisely why it could become dangerous. The relief was real, so was the cost. In a place where men carried weapons, where pride was raw, where law was uncertain, and where many had already lost too much, drunkenness could turn a small insult into an event that altered several lives before morning. Sunday, when it was observed, could intensify loneliness rather than ease it. In settled communities, Sunday had structure. Church, family, cleaner clothing, a pause in work, meals, visiting, rest. In the gold fields, some camps maintained religious services, and travelling ministers did reach miners, preaching under trees, in tents, or in rough buildings. But many men lived far from the habits that had shaped their earlier lives. A day of rest could become a day of gambling, washing, mending, writing letters, drinking, sleeping, or simply sitting with too much time to think. A man who could bear labour 6 days in a row might find quiet more difficult than work. Work kept the mind pointed outward. Rest let it turn back toward home. Homesickness was not childish. It was a serious force. Men missed wives. They missed children. They missed mothers cooking, local jokes, familiar weather, names spoken with affection, even the irritations of home. One of the strange features of migration is that people often discover what they loved only after losing daily access to it. A man who had felt trapped by the same streets and faces might find himself aching for them when surrounded by mountains and strangers. California had promised largeness, but largeness without belonging can feel like exposure. Some men formed deep friendships in the mines, and these relationships could be life-saving. Partners cooked together, pooled supplies, tended each other in sickness, guarded claims, wrote letters for one another, and sometimes stayed loyal through terrible conditions. A mining partnership could become a temporary household. Yet these bonds were often fragile because the gold rush kept people moving. A partner might leave for another strike, a friend might die, a company might split over poor results. A man who had finally found someone he trusted could wake one morning to discover that the road had taken that person too. The whole society of the diggings was unstable. People were always arriving, leaving, failing, moving, or being carried out. Loneliness thrives where continuity is weak. The fear of failure made isolation worse. A man could talk freely about bad weather, high prices, poor food, and dishonest merchants. Those complaints were common and safe. It was harder to say, "I think I have ruined myself." Harder still to say, "I do not know how to go home." That sentence may have sat inside many men like a stone. Returning poor meant facing everyone who had watched them leave with confidence. It meant facing debts, disappointed families, or the knowledge that the money spent could not be restored. Some could return and rebuild, others could not. Shame kept men in California longer than reason would have kept them. Shame made them reinterpret suffering as perseverance. It made leaving seem like cowardice even when staying had become slow destruction. Violence sometimes grew out of that same shame. Not always, but often enough to notice. A desperate man is not automatically a violent man, but desperation reduces the space between feeling wronged and acting on it. The gold rush placed thousands of men in close quarters, armed many of them, fed them poorly, exhausted them physically, filled them with disappointment, and surrounded them with unequal chances. Then it gave them alcohol, rumours, racial prejudice, weak law, and valuable ground to fight over. It would be strange if violence had not followed. The miracle is not that camps became violent. The miracle is that they were not more violent every day. At night, after the stores closed or the saloons grew louder, after the fires burned low and the damp came up from the ground, the loneliness had room to enter more fully. Imagine a man lying under a blanket that never quite dried, listening to men cough in nearby tents. Somewhere a fiddle plays, somewhere two men argue, somewhere a mule shifts and stamps. The creek continues in the dark, indifferent to everyone who spent the day tearing at its banks. He has a letter from home folded in his coat. He has read it too many times already. He knows the words by memory, but he reads them again because the handwriting is the closest thing to a familiar face. The letter says the children ask when he is coming home. It says his wife hopes he is well. It says money is tight, but they are managing. It says everyone believes he will do what he set out to do. That last line should comfort him. Instead, it presses on his chest. What does he do with that pressure? Tomorrow he rises. That is the ordinary answer. He rises because remaining still would make the truth louder. He eats what he has. He goes to the claim, or to the store, or to hear a rumour, or to look for work. He jokes with another man. He complains about prices. He says he thinks the upper bar may show better colour. He behaves, in other words, like a man who still has a plan. That behaviour is not hypocrisy. It is survival. People often continue by acting as if continuation is reasonable until they can find a reason to believe it again. The gold rush did not advertise this kind of endurance, because it would not have sold tickets, wagons, shovels, or newspapers. It advertised the exception, the rich strike, the lucky pan, the man who came home transformed. But the ordinary experience contained far more waiting, sickness, fear, anger, and loneliness than the legend could comfortably hold. For every miner who weighed enough dust to change his life, many more weighed just enough to continue, or not enough even for that. For every camp story told later as adventure, there were quieter memories of fever, hunger, bad letters, cruel men, missing friends, and mornings when the body stood up because there was nothing else to do. By the time a miner had survived months of this, he was not the same person who had left home. Even if he had not lost all his money, even if he had not been badly injured, even if he had avoided the worst violence, something in him had been altered by uncertainty. He had learned how quickly order can thin. He had learned that a man can be surrounded by opportunity and still feel trapped. He had learned that loneliness can exist in a crowd. He had learned that the body has limits, and that ambition often pretends not to hear them. He had also learned, perhaps, that gold does not solve every kind of poverty. There is the poverty of an empty purse, and then there is the poverty of being far from anyone who would care for you if you had nothing. Some men did find gold after all of this. That is the complicated part. The story cannot simply say that sickness, violence, and loneliness led only to failure. There were miners who endured these conditions and came out with real money. There were men who got sick and recovered, fought and survived, missed home and still stayed long enough to strike a good claim. History does not arrange itself neatly so that suffering always warns people away. Sometimes suffering comes before success, and the existence of those successes kept the whole machine turning. A man could look at someone who had survived the same hardships and prospered, and he could tell himself that endurance might still be rewarded. Sometimes it was. More often, the reward arrived too late, too small, or with too many costs already attached. That is where the next turn in this story begins to take shape. Because even success in the gold rush could be unstable. Finding gold was not the same as keeping wealth. A man could strike a good claim and still leave California poor. He could earn more money than he had ever seen before and spend it faster than he understood. He could be cheated, robbed, taxed, overcharged, unlucky, careless, generous, lonely, drunk, or simply caught in an economy designed to absorb loose gold from loose hands. The camps had taught him how to suffer. The stores had taught him how expensive survival could be. The claims had taught him that ownership could vanish. Sickness and violence had taught him that the body and the social order were both fragile. Now came one of the strangest lessons of all. Even the men who found gold were not safe from losing everything. It is tempting to think that the story changes completely once a man finally finds gold. After everything we have walked through together, the long road west, the cold camps, the store counters, the bad food, the sickness, the arguments over claims, you almost want the story to become kinder at that point. You want the pan to shine, the man to laugh, the dust to be poured into a pouch, and some deep unfairness in the world to be corrected by the weight of it. That is how the gold rush still survives in the imagination. A poor man bends over a stream, works harder than everyone else, sees the yellow colour at the bottom, and rises into a new life. But history is rarely that clean. In California, finding gold was not the same as keeping it. A man could take gold out of the ground with his own hands and still end up broke. Not because the gold was imaginary, not because every story of success was a lie. The gold was real. That was the problem. It was real enough to keep men digging, real enough to keep them spending, real enough to make them believe that one good week could undo a year of bad decisions. But it did not arrive in a world built to protect the man who found it. It arrived into a world of high prices, debt, gambling, theft, bad partnerships, loneliness, fires, inflated land schemes, and human appetite. Let us begin with the simple physical fact of gold dust. A miner did not usually pull a tidy fortune from the earth in a form he could lock away and understand. Much of what passed through his hands was dust and small flakes, weighed out in pinches and spoonfuls, carried in buckskin bags, bottles, quills, purses, belts, or hidden pockets. Gold in that form was beautiful, but it was also strangely vulnerable. It could be spilled, it could be stolen, it could be weighed dishonestly, it could be shaved away through bad exchange rates and high prices. It could disappear in a saloon before a man had quite admitted to himself how much he had spent. Coins have numbers stamped on them. Banknotes tell a story of value in printed words. Gold dust required judgment every time it changed hands, and in the gold rush, judgment was often tired, drunk, rushed, hopeful, or desperate. Imagine a miner after his first truly good clean-up. He has had poor weeks before this. He has written home carefully, never lying exactly, but not telling the full truth either. He has eaten beans until he is sick of them. He has patched his trousers. He has watched other men leave for new strikes and wondered whether he should have followed. Then the claim begins to pay. Not in a legendary way, perhaps. Not with some enormous nugget that will be written into newspapers, but enough that his hands tremble a little when he weighs it. Enough to buy more than flour and bacon. Enough to pay a debt at the store. Enough to think seriously, maybe for the first time in months, that he might not have been wrong. That is a powerful moment. It does not make a man cautious. Often it makes him feel restored. It tells him that the suffering had meaning. It tells him that the dream was not foolish. It tells him, dangerously, that more may be coming. A first success could be the beginning of ruin because it changed the scale of a man's expectations. Before he found gold, he wanted proof. Once he found it, he wanted continuation. A poor claim that pays nothing can be abandoned. A good claim that pays once becomes a promise. The miner starts to calculate forward. If 1 week produced this much, then a month might produce this. If the deeper gravel improves, then the season might change everything. He buys better tools. He purchases more food. He may take on help or form a larger partnership. He might borrow against what he expects to find. He might stop living as a man in danger and begin living as a man on the edge of wealth. That change can happen before wealth has actually arrived. There is something in human nature that spends future money with more confidence than present money. The gold rush sharpened that habit because the future seemed to glitter in the ground itself. A miner who had a rich few days could walk into a store differently. The storekeeper noticed. Credit became easier. Supplies became better. The miner might buy boots that he had denied himself, a new coat, a better blanket, tobacco, a proper meal, perhaps even luxuries sent up from San Francisco at absurd prices. None of this was necessarily reckless. A man working hard needs good boots. A man sleeping cold needs a blanket. A man who has lived on monotonous food may need a real meal for the sake of his body and his mind. But the line between repair and indulgence could blur quickly. After months of deprivation, spending felt not only pleasant but deserved. That word deserved matters. The man had crossed mountains or seas. He had endured sickness, high prices, loneliness, and miserable labour. When gold finally came into his hands, he did not experience it as ordinary income. He experienced it as judgment overturned. He had been right. He had earned relief. He had earned a drink, a hotel bed, a better pistol, a night at the gambling table, a meal with meat and pie and coffee that did not taste like camp smoke. He had earned the chance to feel like more than a muddy labourer, and California had built entire streets of businesses ready to sell him that feeling. San Francisco, Sacramento, Stockton, and the mining towns did not merely supply miners, they absorbed them. Gold came down from the hills and passed through counters, scales, bars, gaming tables, boarding houses, land offices, shipping firms, clothing stores, express companies and banks. The city became a kind of mouth. The miner entered with dust, and the city gave him back meals, entertainment, transport, promises, receipts, and sometimes nothing at all. A man could arrive from the mines with enough gold to impress himself and leave a week later with a hangover, a few purchases, a lighter purse, and a renewed determination to go back and recover what he had spent. That cycle was common enough to become part of the structure of the rush. The gold field produced. The town collected. Gambling was one of the fastest ways for gold to change owners. The camps and towns were full of games because the whole society had already accepted risk as a way of life. A miner who had crossed a continent for the chance of a strike was not necessarily frightened by a table where money could double or vanish in an evening. In fact, gambling made a kind of emotional sense. Mining itself felt like gambling slowed down by labour. You put in time, strength, food and hope, and the ground either paid or did not. At a gaming table, the result came faster. Cards and dice compressed the same terrible question into a few minutes. Will luck favour me or not? Men who were cautious at home could become gamblers in California because California had already taught them to measure life by chance. The saloon was not just a place to lose money. It was a place to be seen with money. That distinction is important. A miner who had been invisible in his failure could become briefly important in his success. He could buy rounds. He could tell the story of his claim. He could be congratulated. He could receive the attention that lonely men learn to crave without naming it. Spending became social proof. Dust on the counter showed that the dream had touched him. In a world where status shifted quickly and most men had little history with one another, generosity could create identity. The man who bought drinks was no longer merely another tired digger. He was lucky, bold, open-handed, successful. Of course, that reputation had to be paid for in real gold. Some men lost their gold through dishonesty more directly. Theft was a constant worry because portable wealth attracts people who do not care how it was earned. A miner might hide dust under bedding, sew it into clothing, bury it near camp, carry it on his body, or entrust it to someone who seemed reliable. None of these methods was perfect. Camps were crowded with strangers. Rooms in boarding houses were not secure. Tents could be entered. Pouches could be cut. A man who talked too much about a good clean-up might find that others had listened more carefully than he intended. The successful miner had to protect what he had found, but constant protection is tiring. It changes the way a man sleeps. It changes how he reads faces. Gold could make a person safer in theory and more anxious in practice. Express companies and banks emerged partly because people needed safer ways to move and store gold. This was sensible and necessary, but even formal services required trust in institutions that were themselves young, expensive, and sometimes vulnerable. A man might send gold home and wait months for confirmation that it arrived. He might deposit it, exchange it, or convert it into drafts. Each step introduced fees, delays, and the fear of failure somewhere beyond his sight. To us, sending money feels routine. To a miner in the early 1850s, it could feel like placing the whole meaning of his labour into the hands of strangers, ships, offices, and paper. Some did it successfully, some did not. The problem was not that there was no way to preserve wealth. The problem was that every way required knowledge, judgment, timing, and trust, in a place where many men had already been punished for trusting too easily. Bad investments caught others. A miner who had finally accumulated gold might decide that digging was too uncertain and that he should become one of the people who profited more steadily. This was not a foolish thought. Merchants, landlords, freighters, and service providers often had better prospects than ordinary miners. But entering those businesses required more than gold. It required timing, location, knowledge, partners, supply lines, and a clear sense of demand. A man who had made money in a claim might buy into a store just as a camp began to decline. He might purchase town lots during a speculative rise and watch values fall after the excitement moved elsewhere. He might invest in a freight outfit and lose animals to disease, accident, theft, or bad roads. He might buy shares in a quartz mine that required machinery, expertise, and far more capital than anyone had admitted at the beginning. The gold rush did not only invite men to gamble with pans and shovels, it invited them to gamble with their winnings. Land speculation was especially seductive because it looked more respectable than gambling. A town was growing, a road was rumoured, a new strike had been reported nearby, a ferry crossing seemed promising. A man with gold could buy lots, imagining stores, hotels, warehouses, and rents. Some fortunes were made this way, many small fortunes were lost. Boomtowns could rise with astonishing speed and fade almost as quickly when the local diggings disappointed or a better road bypassed them. A town lot is only valuable if people keep coming to the town. In Gold Rush, California, people followed rumours, rivers, roads, strikes, failures, and prices. They did not always remain where a speculator needed them to remain. Then there were partnerships, the old source of help and trouble. A miner who found gold rarely worked in a vacuum. Partners shared claims, tools, cabins, cooking expenses, and knowledge. A good partnership could preserve wealth by dividing labour and discouraging theft. A bad one could destroy everything. One partner drank too much, another kept poor accounts, another sold a share without permission, another disappeared with dust, another wanted to reinvest in equipment, while another wanted to send money home, another believed the claim was nearly exhausted and wanted to leave, while the rest insisted the best ground lay deeper. Money reveals differences that hardship conceals. Men who could endure hunger together sometimes could not endure profit together. Profit created arguments because it forced decisions. When there is no gold, everyone knows the problem. When there is some gold, the question becomes what to do with it. Save it. Spend it. Pay debts. Improve the claim. Buy into a better claim. Send money home. Move to town. Hire workers. Buy machinery. Leave California. Stay one more season. Every option carried a story about the future, and every man in a partnership might be living in a different story. One saw the gold as rescue and wanted to protect it. Another saw it as seed money for a greater success. Another saw it as proof that they should risk more. Another wanted to celebrate because he could not bear the thought of going immediately back to deprivation after finally tasting relief. The claim had produced gold, but not agreement. The movement from placer mining to more capital-intensive methods also swallowed winnings. In the earliest rush, a man could work with simple tools and little more than strength. As surface deposits declined, more complex operations became necessary in many areas. Ditches, sluices, pumps, dams, tunnels, and later hydraulic equipment required investment. Men who had found some gold could pour it back into the ground through improvements that promised greater returns. Sometimes those improvements worked. Sometimes water failed, a ditch collapsed, timbering gave way, partners quit, claims disappointed, legal conflicts intervened, or the cost of the operation outran the yield. The miner who reinvested was not necessarily foolish. He was adapting to the changing conditions of the gold fields. But adaptation cost money, and not every man who paid the cost lived to see the benefit. There is another, quieter way successful miners went broke. They stayed too long. A man who found enough gold to leave with dignity might not leave because leaving required believing the good luck would not continue. That is a hard thing to accept. If the claim had paid, why not work it longer? If one good season produced a few $1,000s, why not stay for another and return truly independent? If the next layer might be richer, why walk away now? The decision to leave after success is often harder than the decision to leave after failure. Failure gives permission. Success gives temptation. Many men remained until expenses, declining yields, illness, bad luck, or a failed speculation consumed what they might have saved. The stories of men who found gold and still returned poor often have this shape. They made money, then believed the money was evidence of a larger destiny. They did not understand that a good strike might be an event rather than a pattern. They mistook a moment for a future. That is not a gold rush flaw only. It is a human flaw. When life gives a person sudden proof that luck is possible, caution begins to sound like ingratitude. A man thinks, I have come this far, I have endured this much, and now the door is finally opening. Who closes a door the moment it begins to open? The cost of living kept pressing even on successful men. A rich clean-up did not stop the price of food. It did not heal worn clothing, replace broken tools, or remove the need to pay for transport. If a miner moved from camp to town after success, his expenses often rose. Better lodging, better meals, social obligations, fees, entertainment, business opportunities, and the general inflation of a boom society all took their share. The gold rush created an environment where money felt abundant and insecure at the same time. A man could hold more wealth than he had ever held before and still feel that he needed to act quickly or lose his chance to multiply it. That urgency was expensive. Fires destroyed wealth too, especially in fast-built towns where wood, canvas, crowded structures, lamps, cooking fires, and poor planning created constant danger. San Francisco and other settlements suffered repeated fires in the early gold rush years. A miner who had invested in goods, a room, a business, or stored possessions could lose them in a night. Fire in a boom town moves differently from fire in a settled place, with strong organisation and prepared equipment. It runs through temporary buildings and narrow arrangements, fed by the very speed with which the town was made. The gold rush built quickly because no one wanted to wait. Quick building left people vulnerable. A fortune could come from the ground slowly and vanish in flames quickly. Robbery on roads and in camps also threatened successful men. If a miner needed to carry dust from the diggings to a town, he became a moving opportunity. Roads were rough, law uneven, and everyone knew that miners sometimes travelled with gold. Some men joined groups for safety. Some hired transport or express services. Some carried weapons and trusted themselves. But fear travelled with them. A poor miner can move anonymously. A successful one begins to wonder who has noticed. Gold gave a man options, but it also made him visible in ways that could be dangerous. There was also the pressure of generosity. This may sound minor beside theft, gambling, and bad investments, but generosity has ruined many people in many periods. A man who did well might help friends, partners, relatives, or fellow miners in need. He might lend money to someone who promised repayment after the next strike. He might support a sick companion, pay for a burial, fund a new venture, or send money home while keeping too little for himself. Some of these acts were noble, some were socially expected, some were foolish only in hindsight. In a place of instability, people depended on one another, and a man with gold could feel obligated to become a small island of rescue. The gold rush often praised individualism, but survival depended on networks of help. The successful miner could become entangled in other people's desperation. Money sent home created its own complicated reality. A man might send a substantial sum to his wife or family, which was one of the best outcomes the rush could produce. But sending money home did not necessarily mean the man himself remained secure. He might reduce his own reserve because he felt duty strongly, then suffer a run of bad luck. He might believe more gold would follow, and send the first earnings quickly, only to find that the claim declined. He might pay old debts at home, and create honour there while remaining precarious in California. From the family's point of view, he had succeeded. From his own campfire months later, he might be nearly broke again. The emotional effect of finding gold and losing it could be worse than never finding much at all. The man who never succeeds can tell a straight story of disappointment. The man who succeeds briefly has to live with the memory of his own hands holding the answer. He knows it was possible because it happened. He can replay the decisions afterward. The night he spent too much. the partnership he trusted, the claim he sold, the investment he made, the week he stayed in town, the letter he wrote too confidently, the moment he should have sent more home or left for good. Regret becomes more specific after success. It has dates, faces, counters, tables, signatures, receipts. This is why some men became almost unable to stop chasing recovery. Losing money you never had is one thing. Losing money after possessing it creates a wound that demands repair. A miner who once held a few $1,000s in dust and then lost it could spend years trying to return to that point. Not wealth, exactly. Restoration. He was not merely seeking a future now. He was trying to undo a past decision. That kind of pursuit is dangerous because it feels morally necessary. He tells himself he is not gambling. He is recovering what should still be his. The gold rush was full of men living under that burden. They had proof that fortune could touch them. They had proof that they could also mishandle it or lose it to forces beyond control. That combination made them restless. They moved to new strikes, took new risks, entered new ventures, borrowed, partnered, speculated, and stayed. Some eventually rebuilt. Others thinned out into the background of California life, becoming labourers, teamsters, farmers, clerks, drifters, or men who spoke less and less about what they had once found. A man who went west to return rich might remain west because returning poor after having once been rich enough to leave was too bitter. The public memory of the gold rush has never known quite what to do with these men. They do not fit neatly. They were not simple failures because they found gold. They were not lasting successes because they lost it. Their stories disturb the clean moral lessons people like to draw. Hard work did not always save them. Luck did not always save them. Even opportunity did not save them when opportunity arrived inside a world designed to drain it away. They show us that wealth is not merely acquired. It must be protected, understood, converted, stored, defended, and sometimes walked away with before the surrounding world can take it back. Think again of the miner after a good clean-up standing outside a store or saloon at dusk. His boots are muddy, his hands are cracked. He has gold on him. Real gold, the thing that pulled him across the country. For a moment, everything feels possible. He can eat well tonight. He can pay what he owes. He can write home with confidence. He can buy better equipment. He can keep going. He can rest. He can become the man he said he would become. The danger is that all of these choices arrive at once. Gold does not tell a man what to do with it. It only gives him the terrifying freedom to decide. And in California, every decision had someone waiting to profit from it. If he saved it, a bank or express company handled it. If he spent it, merchants collected it. If he drank it, saloons absorbed it. If he gambled it, the table took its chance. If he invested it, promoters and partners stepped forward. If he carried it, thieves might watch. If he sent it home, distance and fees entered the story. If he hid it, fear kept him company. If he left with it, he had to accept that the richest days might continue without him. There was no choice untouched by risk. So the men who found gold and still went broke were not simply careless figures at the edge of the legend. They were central to it. They reveal the gold rush as a system, not just an adventure. The system did not end when the pan glittered. In many ways, that was when it tightened. The poor miner had little to lose except time, strength, and hope. The successful miner had something everyone could measure. His dust made him a customer, a target, a partner, a speculator, a debtor, a generous friend, a man with options and therefore new dangers. Gold solved one problem and created several more. By the time such a man finally admitted the money was gone, the fact of having once found it could feel almost unreal. The store goods had been consumed, the drinks had been poured, the cards had been played, the claim had thinned, the tools had broken, the partner had moved on, the investment had failed, the letter home had been too hopeful, the pouch that once seemed heavy now folded flat in his hand. He might still have a little dust, enough to eat, enough to move, enough to pretend the story was not over. But something in him would know that a rare chance had passed through his fingers and entered the wider machinery of California. Morning would still come. That is the stubborn fact underneath all of this. The sun rose over camps and towns without regard for who had won or lost the night before. Men still needed breakfast. Claims still needed working. Debt still needed answering. Boats still left. Wagons still moved. Rumours still travelled. A man who had lost gold after finding it had to decide whether to chase another strike, find wages, go home, write home, stay silent, or simply keep walking until the next possible future appeared. And for many, the hardest road was not the one over the Sierra or around Cape Horn. It was the road back from the dream after the dream had briefly come true and still failed to save them. There is a kind of walk that almost never appears in the old drawings of the gold rush. We see the leaving, we see the wagons, we see the ships crowded with men leaning toward the west. We see the miner standing in the stream with his pan. We see the saloon, the campfire, the mule train, the mountain road, the lucky hand holding a nugget up to the light. What we almost never see is the walk back. Not the triumphant return with a heavy pouch and a new coat and a story everyone wants to hear. The other return, the quiet one. The man moving east with worn boots, poor health, little money, and a version of himself he does not quite know how to explain. That walk does not make good advertising. It does not sell maps or shovels or passage tickets. It is not the image a nation likes to preserve when telling stories about opportunity. But it happened, again and again, in ways both literal and emotional. Many men who went to California did not come back rich. Some did not come back at all. Some stayed because they could not afford the journey home. Some returned with less than they had carried west. Some came back with gold enough to pay a few debts but not enough to change a life. And some came home with nothing visible except age in the face, weakness in the body, and a silence that settled over the whole adventure like dust after a wagon passes. To understand that return, you have to remember what going home actually required. A man did not simply decide one morning that the gold rush had failed him, and then appear at his family's door a week later. California was still far away from the eastern states, from the farms of Ohio, the towns of New England, the river settlements of Missouri, the streets of New York, the small communities that had sent men west with prayers and public confidence. Returning meant arranging passage by sea or crossing the continent again. It meant money for food, transport, lodging, supplies, and delays. It meant strength enough to endure another long journey. It meant admitting, at least to himself, that the westward gamble had reached its end. For a man who had lost nearly everything, even getting home could become one more thing he could not afford. That is one of the least discussed traps of the gold rush. Distance itself held men in place. They had crossed so far to reach California that failure did not automatically send them back. If a miner lost his savings in a town near home, he might walk to a relative, return to a farm, take day labour, sleep in a familiar barn, or ask credit from someone who knew his family. In California, failure could leave him stranded among strangers. The road behind him was not a road in the ordinary sense. It was an ocean voyage, an isthmus crossing, or thousands of miles of overland travel. A man could discover that he had enough money to continue failing, but not enough money to quit. So he stayed. He found wages. He cooked, hauled, cut timber, worked for richer mining operations, drove animals, loaded freight, dug ditches, repaired roads, washed dishes, carried goods, or did whatever labour would keep food in his mouth. He had come west to be independent, and in the end he might become a hired hand in the very economy that had fed on his dream. There should be no shame in that kind of work. It took strength, discipline, and humility to survive after disappointment. But for many men, it must have felt like a private defeat. The gold rush had promised a different relationship between effort and reward. It had suggested that a man willing to risk himself could step outside ordinary wages and come back transformed. To end up working for wages in California, far from home, after spending so much to get there, was not just hard. It was confusing. It made the whole journey feel like a circle drawn in pain. He had left Labour behind to find gold, and now Labour had found him again on the other side of the continent. Some did decide to return, and the journey home carried a weight very different from the journey out. On the way west, hardship had a direction. Every discomfort could be explained by the destination ahead. Bad food, bad roads, danger, expense, illness, and fear could all be placed under the heading of necessary sacrifice. The man could tell himself, this is the price of the chance. The return stripped that explanation away. If he had nothing to show for it, the hardship no longer pointed toward reward. It pointed backward toward what had been lost. Every mile home might bring him closer to people who remembered the confidence with which he had left. Picture one of those men waiting in San Francisco for passage east. He has sold what he can. Maybe his mining tools brought little. Maybe his blankets are too worn to matter. Maybe he has kept a small trunk or a bundle of clothing and a few objects from the diggings that he cannot bring himself to throw away. The city around him is louder and more built than when he first arrived. Streets that were once half mud and improvisation now carry more businesses, more signs, more men who've learned how to make money from the constant movement of others. He watches newcomers arrive with the same bright tension he once had. They're asking questions. They're buying supplies. They're impatient to get to the mines. Some of them may even ask him for advice. What can he say? Do not go? That would sound bitter. Be careful. That is too small. The truth is too large to hand to a stranger in a single sentence. So perhaps he says the mines are not what they were. Perhaps he says prices are high. Perhaps he says a man needs more money than he thinks. Perhaps he says nothing useful at all, because advice rarely reaches people who are still hearing the dream louder than the warning. The ship home, for those who could take one, was not the same kind of ship as the one out. Outward bound, men talked. They made plans. They compared guidebooks, argued routes, estimated returns, and imagined claims waiting in the sun. Homeward bound, the conversations were different. Some men had done well and wanted everyone to know it. Some had done modestly and were grateful enough. Some had failed and spoke carefully. A ship carrying returning miners must have contained several versions of the gold rush at once. The proud, the embarrassed, the sick, the lucky, the angry, the quiet. One man might carry dust sewn into his clothing. Another might carry only a letter he had delayed sending because he could not bear to write the truth. Another might be coughing from a sickness he had never fully recovered from in the camps. Another might have a limp from an accident with a wagon or a collapsing bank. Another might have a few souvenirs for children who expected something wonderful from California and would not understand that the small object represented the last thing he could afford to bring. The return by land had its own bitterness. The overland trails looked different when travelled east by disappointed men. Places that had once seemed like stages on the way to fortune became markers of a decision gone wrong. A river crossing remembered from the first journey. A stretch of dry country where animals had suffered. A grave beside the trail maybe one noticed on the way out and now seen again with different eyes. The land did not change its expression for failure. It did not apologise. It remained wide, difficult, and indifferent. A man walking or riding home through that space had more time than he wanted to think about what he had believed and what had happened instead. There were families waiting, and waiting changes people too. A wife who had spent months or years managing without her husband did not simply freeze in place until he returned. She had made decisions. She had stretched money. She had answered questions from children. She had defended the hope of his success in public, and perhaps doubted it in private. She had read his letters, studied what he said and what he did not say, watched the gaps between messages grow, and listened to neighbours discuss other men's luck. If he sent money, she may have paid debts or bought needed goods, and felt the journey was at least beginning to justify itself. If he sent little or nothing, she may have had to carry the weight of his absence without the relief that was supposed to make it worthwhile. A man returning empty did not return to the same household he left. Even if the house looked the same, the people inside had lived through his absence. Children had grown. A baby might not know him. An older child might remember him as stronger or happier than he now appeared. A wife might feel relief, anger, tenderness, exhaustion, and disappointment all at once. These emotions are difficult because none of them cancels the others. She could be glad he was alive and still angry that so much had been risked. He could be ashamed and still resent being judged. Both could have suffered honestly. Both could feel that the other did not fully understand the cost. The first evening home must have been one of the hardest moments for some returning miners. Not the public arrival, if there was one. Not the handshake at the door or the first embrace. The evening after, the room quieter, the neighbours gone, the children asleep or pretending to sleep. The returned man sitting in a chair that once belonged naturally to him, now feeling slightly like a guest in his own life. Someone asks what happened. Maybe gently, maybe not. He begins with the route, because the route is easier. He can describe the ship, the crossing, the mountains, the camps, the prices, the work. These are facts that do not immediately require confession. But eventually the story has to reach the money. How much did he make? How much remains? What debts are waiting? What must be done now? It is possible some men told everything. There are always people with a gift for honesty, or a need for it. But many must have shortened the story, not lied completely. Just arranged it so that failure sounded like misfortune rather than misjudgment. The claims were poor, prices were outrageous, thieves were everywhere. The easy gold was gone before he arrived. The water failed. A partner cheated him. Sickness took the best weeks. All of these explanations could be true. That is what makes the telling so complicated. The gold rush genuinely was expensive, unfair, dangerous, and unpredictable. A man could make reasonable choices and still fail. But he could also make foolish choices along the way, and the difference between those categories is not always easy to speak aloud at the family table. The neighbours would want the story too. They had watched him leave. Perhaps they had contributed supplies, loaned money, or spoken admiringly of his courage. In many communities, returning from California made a man temporarily interesting no matter how he had done. People wanted descriptions. What was San Francisco like? Did men really find gold in rivers? Were the camps as wild as reported? What did the mountains look like? How much could a man earn? Was it worth going now? A failed miner could become an unwilling witness against the dream, but his testimony was not always believed. People often treat failure as personal when they want hope to remain available. They might think he went too late, chose the wrong route, trusted the wrong partners, lacked persistence, spent too freely, or simply had bad luck that would not apply to them. In this way, the gold rush protected itself. The failures returned, but their failure did not necessarily kill the dream for others. It merely became a warning that could be explained away. Some men did not return to their old communities because they could not bear that process. They stayed in California, moved to Oregon, went to other mining regions, enlisted in other ventures, or drifted into the broader movement of the American West. Failure can uproot a person even after the original reason for leaving has disappeared. Once a man has sold land, broken routine, crossed distance, and lived among strangers, going back may feel impossible for reasons beyond money. The old life may no longer fit. He may not want to be known as the man who left and failed. He may prefer a place where no one knows what he promised. That is another way the gold rush took people. It did not always kill them or impoverish them in a visible way. Sometimes it separated them permanently from the lives they had meant to improve. There were also men who came home with some money, but not enough to match the scale of the sacrifice. This kind of return is harder to classify. Suppose a man left with a farm mortgaged, a shop neglected, a wife overburdened, children missing him, and 2 years of his life spent in California. Suppose he returns with several $100s, perhaps more than he might have saved at home in the same period, but less than the family imagined, less than the debts require, less than the cost of absence. Was that success? Was it failure? History often likes clear categories, but ordinary lives rarely provide them. A man could bring money home and still feel that the gold rush had beaten him, because the money did not equal the cost he now understood. Health was part of that cost. Some returned older than their years. Bad diet, fever, exposure, injuries, and exhaustion did not always end when the journey ended. A man could bring home a cough, a weakened body, damaged joints, chronic pain, or the memory of sickness that made him more cautious and less energetic. His family might expect the same person who had left, only richer. Instead, he might be poorer and less able to work. That was a harsh outcome, especially in households that depended on physical labour. The gold rush could take a man's savings first, then his strength, then send him home needing care from the very people he had hoped to relieve. The emotional injuries are harder to document, but they should not be ignored. Men of that period often lacked a public language for disappointment, trauma, depression, or anxiety. They had words like nerves, melancholy, discouragement, homesickness, weakness, or simply trouble. A returning miner might have seen death, violence, disease, fire, theft, and destitution. He might have buried friends. He might have participated in violence he did not later know how to remember. He might have lived for years with the constant pressure of uncertainty. Then he was expected to resume ordinary life, fix the fence, return to the counter, reopen the shop, plough the field, be a husband, be a father, be grateful he survived. Some did exactly that. People can be extraordinarily resilient, but resilience does not mean nothing happened to them. What would silence sound like in such a home? It might sound like a man refusing to discuss California after the first few tellings. It might sound like a wife not asking certain questions because she sees what they do to his face. It might sound like children learning that father's time in the gold country is a story for outsiders, not for the kitchen. It might sound like a few objects kept in a drawer. A worn gold pan hung in a shed. A letter from the camps folded and refolded. A small pinch of dust, perhaps. Saved not because it was worth much, but because throwing it away would feel like throwing away the whole reason he had gone. Families often keep relics of hard decisions, not to celebrate them exactly, to give the past a place to sit. The nation, meanwhile, kept the brighter version. California became a state. San Francisco grew. Merchants, bankers, landowners, and industrial mining interests built lasting wealth. The gold rush accelerated American expansion, intensified conflict, transformed California's economy, and drew people from around the world. In the public story, the rush became proof of energy, ambition, and national destiny. It became part of the American habit of describing risk as virtue when enough people profit from it. The failed men did not disappear, but they became less useful to the legend. A culture built around opportunity has trouble making room for people who took the opportunity seriously and were harmed by it. That is why this quiet walk home matters. It corrects the shape of the story. It reminds us that losing everything does not always look like a single disaster. It can look like a series of reasonable steps, each one encouraged by the world around you. Sell a few things, buy supplies, take the long road, pay high prices, work hard, stay a little longer, borrow against hope, move to a new claim, spend to survive, spend to recover, spend to feel human. Write home carefully. Keep going because stopping would make the loss real. Then one day the pouch is empty, the body is tired, and the dream that once filled the horizon has become a problem of how to get back. I want to be fair to them. It is easy to sit far away in time and say they should have known. They should have understood that too many people were chasing the same deposits. They should have expected high prices. They should have saved their first earnings, avoided gambling, distrusted rumours, left earlier, worked differently, chosen another route, stayed home. Some of those criticisms may be true in individual cases, but people do not make life decisions from the safety of hindsight. They make them inside fear, hope, pressure, pride, and incomplete information. The men who went to California lived in a world where economic security was hard for many to reach, where land and wages could feel limited, where newspapers printed astonishing reports, where neighbours were leaving, where the nation itself seemed to be saying that the West was the place where a man could become new. They believed something many people still believe in different forms, that one bold move might solve the problem of an ordinary life. That belief is not foolish by itself. It has carried people across oceans, into new trades, onto farms, into schools, into businesses, into risks that really did change families for the better. The tragedy of the gold rush is that the belief was fed into a system where the odds were worse than the advertisements admitted, and where the costs arrived whether or not the reward did. Some people won, some won spectacularly, but many paid for the possibility of winning until they had nothing left to pay with. Near the end of this story, I keep thinking of a man approaching his old town at dusk. Not because every return happened this way, but because it lets us see the emotional truth of it. The road is familiar, the trees, the fences, the church steeple, the turn toward home. He has imagined this moment many times, but in his imagination he was better dressed, stronger, carrying proof that the absence had been worthwhile. Instead, he is tired. His luggage is light, maybe too light. There are people he hopes not to meet before reaching the house. He wants one more hour before the questions begin. One more hour in which he is neither the hopeful man who left, nor the disappointed man who returned, but simply a traveller on a road he knows. Inside the house, someone sees him. A wife, a child, a parent, a sibling. The first emotion is probably relief, because he is alive, and life is not a small thing after such a journey. Then come the other emotions, slower and more complicated. The hug, the looking at his face, the noticing of thinness, the sound of his voice, the awkwardness of the first meal. He sits at a table where food has a different meaning now. Not camp beans, not overpriced flour, not a saloon supper bought with dust, but home food, ordinary food, food that belongs to a settled life. It may comfort him. It may also hurt. Someone asks about California. He answers. Maybe he tells a funny story first, because humour is a safe door into pain. He describes a man falling into a creek, or a mule that refused to move, or the outrageous price of eggs. Everyone laughs. The room loosens. Then the story moves closer to the real thing. The sickness, the claims, the money, the friend who died, the partner who left, the week he thought he had finally found good ground, the way it ended. He does not tell all of it. No one ever tells all of it the first night. Some of it will come later, some of it never will. And after the house is quiet, after the lamp is lowered and the first day home has ended, he lies awake. Not in a tent, not on damp ground, not under a wagon, in a bed he once knew. The sounds are familiar, and that familiarity may feel almost unbearable. He has come back, but he cannot return to the moment before he left. No one can. The gold rush took his money, perhaps. It took time. It may have taken health, confidence, and ease. But it also gave him knowledge he did not ask for. He now knows how far a dream can carry a person. He knows how much can be spent in the act of believing. He knows that gold can be real and still not save you. That is the part I want us to hold on to as we leave him there. Not as a symbol, not as a fool, not as a warning carved too neatly for our benefit, but as a person. A man among many who lived inside one of the great fever dreams of American history and discovered that opportunity can have teeth. The gold rush was not only a story of wealth pulled from rivers, it was a story of homes emptied, debts made, bodies worn down, camps razed and abandoned, merchants enriched, claims fought over, letters delayed, families strained, and men walking back toward ordinary life with less than they had hoped and more memory than they knew what to do with. So the next time you hear the words gold rush, maybe do not picture only the glitter. Picture the store counter, the muddy boots, the sick tent, the empty pan, the letter home, the ship waiting in the harbour, and the man on the road at dusk trying to decide what kind of story he can bear to tell. Because for many Americans, the gold rush was not the moment they found everything. It was the moment they learned how easily everything could be traded for the chance of something more.